The story starts inside a grand royal palace, where a young boy named Van jolts awake in an enormous bed. As he slowly lifts his hands in front of his face, a strange wave of confusion hits him. His hands look tiny and frail. That's when the realization slowly creeps in. He's been reincarnated from the miserable life he once knew. In his past life, Van was stuck in a draining routine, working a dead-end job just to survive, until fate gave him a second chance and reborn him with a noble title. Now reincarnated as a young noble in a distant village, Van carefully climbs out of bed and balances on a small wooden stool just to get a peek outside. The view stuns him. Tall buildings, endless land, and peaceful skies stretch as far as he can see. But before he can soak it all in, his maid Tilly bursts in, panicking at the sight of him standing up so high. After all, Van is supposed to be just 2 years old, but when he calmly responds with mature, articulate words, Tilly freezes in place, stunned by what she just heard. The moment he hears himself speak, Van realizes something even crazier. He doesn't just have memories from his old life, he actually remembers parts of his current one too. His past life in Japan is blending with the time he's already spent in this world, confirming beyond doubt that this reincarnation is real. Later that evening, Van joins his father and siblings at the dinner table. The atmosphere is tense, heavy with awkward silence. After a while, his father Halpa breaks the ice by asking his second son, Card, what he plans to study that day. Card hesitates, then says he'll be focusing on fire magic and combat tactics. Halpa nods and turns to the third son, Sesto, who says he'll also be studying magic. Finally, Halpa looks at Van and asks the same question. Without hesitation, Van replies that he still has a lot to learn, so he wants to begin by studying the kingdom's history and traditions. His brothers freeze as they stare at him, rattled by how a 2-year-old just gave a more thoughtful answer than either of them. Halpa suddenly breaks into loud laughter, clearly amused and genuinely impressed by how sharp and promising Van is at such a young age. He says he's got high hopes that Van will end up inheriting the same strong fire magic talent that both he and Van's mother were born with. Halpa then mentions that the magic aptitude test will happen when Van hits 8 years old, and he warns him not to mess it up. In this world, magical ability isn't just important, it's everything, and it's usually divided into 4 primary elements: fire, water, wind, and earth. While other forms exist, anything outside those 4 is seen as second-rate or even shameful. Once breakfast is over, Van heads off to his study, where the maids start giving him a basic rundown of how society and daily life work in this world. Just as they're finishing up, the head butler, Esparta, strides into the room and slams a thick stack of books onto Van's desk. Esparta is no ordinary servant. He's a veteran butler who's been working under Van's father for many years. Despite that, Van still finds him terrifying. Esparta then tells Van he's already aware that he's begun learning to read and do some basic math, so he bluntly asks how far he's gotten. Van admits he's still struggling with reading, and in terms of math, he can only handle simple addition and subtraction. But Esparta knows the kid's got more potential than that, so without asking, he decides to take over as Van's personal instructor, and from that day on, Van's life turns into a nightmare. The lessons are brutal, long hours, no breaks, no excuses. Still, those intense sessions pay off, as just within a few weeks, Van manages to read and write with ease. After grinding nonstop for 2 solid years, Van finally hits his 4th birthday and begins his sword training. At the start, he's completely hopeless. He keeps getting beaten, even by the maid during sparring practice. Still, he doesn't back down and shows up for training day after day without fail. And by the time he turns 5, all that hard work begins to show. He starts facing off against older boys, ones already in training to become soldiers, and can hold his own against them. Van realizes their moves are sloppy and easy to predict, so he beats them over and over again with little effort. The other kids are stunned by how good he is and start wondering if he's some kind of prodigy. What really sets him apart, though, is that unlike his snobbish older brothers, Van actually talks to the commoner kids and treats them like equals, forming genuine friendships instead of acting like he's above them. Soon afterward, Van takes a moment to catch his breath and grabs a glass of water. Just then, the Deputy Knight Commander D steps into the room and politely asks to see Van's hands. As he carefully inspects them, D's expression tightens because there are no calluses, no bruises, so it's clear Van hasn't been wielding a sword for very long. Van confirms it, explaining that his time has mostly been swallowed up by endless studying. D tells him straight up that Esparta has been pushing him nearly 3 times harder than usual when it comes to academics, so D offers to speak with Esparta and suggests a better balance, less time buried in books, more time on combat. After all, life isn't just about study. Then, with a confident smile, D swears that if Van gets the extra time, he'll personally shape him into a master swordsman. Van, however, politely declines the offer, saying he's confident he can handle both. D nods, impressed by his determination, and suggests that in that case, he'll become Van's official instructor to ensure his training stays sharp and focused. But training under D quickly spirals into another kind of torment. His drills are brutal, relentless, and leave no room for rest, but even so, Van pushes through. and deep down, he knows the truth. Despite all the exhaustion, every day in this new life has felt more rewarding than anything he experienced before. For the first time ever, he feels like he's actually living, and with that, Van silently promises himself that he's going to make this second chance count and enjoy every bit of it. 1 year afterward, Van turns 6, and by now, the constant cycle of back-to-back training and studying starts to wear on him. He begins to feel burned out, realizing that if things go on like this, he'll never experience the fun life he once dreamed of, so he makes a decision to start living like a normal child and carve out time to enjoy himself. Not long after, he tells one of the maids he wants to go outside and play. She takes him to the town market, and Van is blown away by the chaos and energy. The crowds, the chatter, the colorful goods on display everywhere. As they walk, his eyes lock onto a massive building towering above the stalls, the Merry Chamber of Commerce. He stares at it in awe, but before he can admire it too long, something unsettling happens. A child bound in shackles is being dragged through the crowd. Horrified, Van immediately asks the man what's going on. The man coldly replies that he's selling his own son into slavery, and since the boy belongs to him, he has every right to do as he pleases. The maid quietly explains that in poor families this happens often. When they can't afford to raise their children, they sell them off to survive, and it's a heartbreaking reality of this world. Van admits it's painful to witness, but deep down, he also feels helpless because he knows there's little he can do to stop it. Just then, a lady named Rosalie stepped forward and politely greeted Van, saying it was a privilege to be at his service. Van turned to her and asked how much the man would be paid for selling his kid. Rosalie explained that the price varies based on the child's magical aptitude, and upon hearing that the boy possessed a thieving attribute, which was ranked among the lowest, she stated that he'd be worth no more than 3 silver coins. Enraged by this, the man lost it and began furiously kicking his shitty son, shouting at him for being damn useless. He then grabbed the boy by the arm and stormed off, saying they were going to try a different place. But before he could get far, Van stepped in and blocked his path, calmly stating that he would buy the boy for 5 silver coins. Without a second thought, the man accepted the deal, snatched the coins, and walked off without so much as a glance back. Van crouched down in front of the boy and introduced himself. The boy quietly replied, saying his name was Kamsin. Van then told him that he was free to go wherever he pleased. He never had any intention of keeping him. He just bought him so he could release him. But after learning that Kamsin had no place to return to, Van suggested he stay with him instead. One of the guards nearby voiced concern, warning Van that the Marquis might disapprove of him bringing a random boy into the estate. But if Kamsin were officially registered as Van's slave, then no one could object. Van turned to Kamsin and asked if that arrangement was alright with him, and Kamsin nodded. From that point on, Kamsin became Van's slave in name. Rosalie then reminded them that before finalizing anything, they had to complete the slave-binding ritual. Both Van and Kamsin reached their hands out at the same time, and following Rosalie's directions, the contract was forged and a faint glowing crest appeared on the back of Kamsin's hand. That symbol would remain there permanently as proof of their contract, for as long as it stayed in effect. Once it was done, Van brought Kamsin with him into the Chamber of Commerce to get him properly dressed and out of the ragged, grimy clothes of a street-bound slave. A few days later, back inside the royal estate, Van was about to enjoy a rare moment of calm and treat himself to a cookie. Just as he raised it to his mouth, Kamsin entered the room to report that Dee had shown up for training. Van instantly froze, and without even blinking, he handed the damn cookie to Kamsin as a bribe and told him to go outside and let Dee know he wasn't available, because the thought of facing another one of Dee's ruthless training sessions was unbearable. Kamsin nods and goes outside to deliver the message, which makes Dee look visibly disappointed. But since he's already here and eager to train someone, he grabs Kamsin and decides to start drilling him instead. 2 more years slip by, and Van finally hits his 8th birthday, the age when every noble child is tested for magical aptitude. Word of his upcoming test spreads like wildfire, sparking curiosity across the entire region. Nobles, servants, guards, and even common traders buzz with anticipation. Everyone expects great things from Van, especially with both of his parents being exceptional fire mages. His father, Halpa, is especially confident. He's certain Van will inherit at least a fire affinity. But on the day of the test, the entire hall is stunned into silence. Against every expectation, Van shows no affinity for fire, water, wind, or earth. Instead, his only magical aptitude is for production magic, an ability ranked as the absolute lowest, widely mocked, and dismissed as the most worthless form of magic there is. The room goes cold, and Halpa's face twists with rage as the weight of disappointment crashes down. Without warning, he unsheathes his blade and charges forward, ready to strike Van down then and there. Frozen in place, Van can't speak, can't run, and his mind goes completely blank. But just before the blade falls, Mercia, the eldest son, steps in front of him and blocks the attack. Rather than let blood be spilled, Mercia suggests a different path. He suggests assigning Van to manage a remote village that recently came under their control. Mercia explains that the village is isolated and underdeveloped, and its people haven't yet sworn loyalty to the family. and by sending Van as its new lord, they could stabilize the region while keeping him out of the way. Halpa pauses, then slowly lowers his sword as the idea sinks in. After a tense moment, he nods in agreement, saying the suggestion is reasonable. Without even looking at Van, he declares that from now on, Van will govern that land. Then he turns his back and orders Van to pack up and leave immediately, stating coldly that someone so useless has no place under his roof. Once Halpa leaves, Mercia bows deeply and apologizes for making such a shameful suggestion. But Van stops him, saying there's no need for apologies because if Mercia hadn't stepped in, he'd be dead right now. The following morning, Van gathers his things and gets ready to head out to the remote village, but to his own surprise, he feels excited. He imagines it'll be a quiet place with little responsibility, where he might finally enjoy the peaceful, easy life he's always dreamed of. But that illusion gets crushed fast when Dee and Esparta announce they're coming along to continue his training and studies. Van lets out a long, exhausted sigh, already picturing the nightmare ahead. And as if that weren't enough, his favorite maid insists on tagging along too, saying she refuses to be separated from him. With everything packed and ready, Van climbs into the carriage and sets off toward a new chapter, still holding on to a tiny shred of hope that he'll finally catch a break and have a little fun. After cruising through the woods in his carriage for a bit, Van decides to kill time by experimenting with a bit of production magic. With some focus and effort, he manages to conjure a miniature sword in the palm of his hand. Kamzin watches without much of a reaction because he already knows Van's got a knack for this stuff and picks up new skills in no time. Still, with everything that's happened, being exiled and stripped of his title, Van brings up something that's been weighing on him. He tells Kamzin there's no real reason for him to keep serving as his slave anymore, so if Kamzin's not up for the journey or doesn't feel like sticking around, Van says he can just dissolve the contract and set him free to live however he wants. But Kamzin instantly shuts the idea down without even thinking twice. He firmly tells Van that he already chose this path and didn't do it on a whim. He makes it clear that he'd gladly throw his life on the line if it meant keeping Van safe, no matter what kind of trouble they run into. Hearing that, Van has no choice but to respect Kamzin's loyalty, though part of him still feels uneasy about it. Out of nowhere, the carriage jerks to a stop, throwing everyone off balance. Van glances out the window and spots chaos up ahead. The village they were heading toward is under siege. The knights traveling with him immediately assume it's a raid, probably just a bunch of low-level bandits or washed-up mercenaries looking for something easy to steal. Dee scans the attackers' formation and does a quick head count, around 50 of them. Judging by the numbers, he figures that if they all launched a coordinated assault, they'd have a good shot at wiping out the enemy without much hassle, so tactically speaking, it looks doable. But one of the adventurers in their group, a guy named Ortho, isn't on board with that idea. He reminds Dee that their orders were straightforward from the start: protect Van if he's in danger. Right now, Van isn't hurt, and no one's coming after him directly, so as far as Ortho's concerned, jumping into a fight that isn't their responsibility would be a reckless waste of lives and way outside the scope of their agreement. Dee's expression tightens with frustration, but even so, he declares that he's going in. He says he can't just sit back and watch while innocent villagers are butchered right in front of him. Whether anyone follows him or not, he's ready to charge in alone. Before he can take off, he asks the adventurers to stay put and make sure Van's protected in case things spiral out of control. Just as Dee prepares to move, Esparta suddenly speaks up and shuts the whole idea down. Esparta cuts straight to the point, telling Dee that throwing himself into a reckless fight like that would be downright idiotic, especially given how vital he is to the kingdom. If Dee dies here, it'd cripple their military's future. As a renowned and highly capable elemental mage, Esparta lays out a smarter approach. He suggests building a powerful defensive barrier around their position to keep Van secure, while the adventurers provide ranged cover from behind the shield to chip away at the attackers. Once the enemy's focus shifts entirely to their front, Dee and the knights would break off and hit them with a surprise assault from the right flank. Esparta's confident that if they pull it off properly, it'll lead to a clean victory, but Van quickly catches what this plan actually means. For the enemy to focus on one spot, someone would need to stay out in the open as bait. That someone is Esparta himself, and Esparta confirms Van's suspicion, explaining that unless he takes on that role, Dee and the others would be dragged into a straight-up brawl and probably won't make it out alive. Hearing that, Van fully grasps the weight of what Esparta is putting on the line. If something goes wrong, Esparta would be the one paying the price with his life, and losing both the kingdom's top strategist and its strongest warrior in one battle would be a devastating loss, one that the land might never recover from. With that in mind, Van steps forward and insists on taking the decoy role himself. Tilly instantly rejects the idea the second it leaves his mouth, stating flat out that she'd rather take the risk than let Van put himself in the line of fire. Kamzin agrees without hesitation, standing tall beside Van. But even with their protests, Van gently tells them both that he values them far too much, and that's exactly why he can't allow either of them to take that risk for his sake. Van lays out his own plan next. He'll ride straight into the enemy lines using the carriage as bait, drawing their full attention while the others hit them from long range on both sides. As he turns to walk away, he reminds them that he didn't spend years training with a sword for nothing, and he's confident he can handle himself in a direct fight. Still, somewhere deep inside, he quietly accepts that if this really is where his story ends, he'd be at peace with it, so long as it's for something worth dying for. Ortho stares after him, stunned by the sheer recklessness of the idea. Hearing those words takes him back to his days at the guild, the day he first received the mission to guard Van. At the time, he absolutely despised the idea. To him, all nobles were arrogant scum not worth lifting a blade for. But since he planned on operating in the first Yo March anyway, he took the job. What he didn't expect was Van himself. He still remembers the young noble walking up to him, bowing with sincerity and thanking him from the bottom of his heart. No arrogance, no airs, just honest gratitude. Van had even gone out of his way to praise Ortho's skills, treating him not like a servant, but like an equal. It was the first time Ortho realized that maybe not all nobles were rotten. Snapping back to the present, Ortho moves in front of Van and refuses flat out. He says there's no way in hell they're letting some kid throw himself into danger like that. Dee and Esparta step up right after, siding with Ortho without hesitation. With that, the original plan gets tossed out. Esparta takes charge and quickly draws up a new strategy. He'll summon a defensive wall around their group, shielding Van. Behind it, the adventurers will rain down long-range attacks to thin the enemy ranks. At the same time, Dee and his knights will strike from the left, while Ortho leads a second charge from the right. They waste no time, and Esparta slams his staff to the ground and erects a massive magical barrier. From behind it, arrows and spells start flying, taking out a wave of bandits before they even realize what hit them. Chaos erupts as the rest scramble to respond, just in time to see Dee and his squad slice through their front lines like butter. But right in the middle of the mess, the bandit leader breaks through the formation and charges past the wall, heading straight for Pluriel. But just as his weapon swings down, Van jumps in, intercepting him at the last second. His blade flashes, slicing through the man's Achilles tendon and sending him crashing to the ground in agony. And before the thug can even cry out, Khamsin follows up with a crushing blow that finishes him off for good. Soon after the fighting ends, the last of the bandits are rounded up and tied down, completely neutralizing the threat to the village. With the danger behind them and the mission technically complete, some of the adventurers decide it's time to move on, eager to take on new jobs elsewhere. But Ortho lingers, clearly impressed, not just by Van's swordplay, but by how calmly and decisively he led the group during the battle. That spark of curiosity grows into admiration, and Ortho decides to stick around a bit longer, offering his support to Van directly. His party members agree without hesitation, choosing to stay and lend their strength as well. Once things settle, Van steps up to formally introduce himself to the village as their new lord. He addresses the village chief, a man named Rhonda, and thanks him for allowing them to help. Rhonda, still shaken but grateful, expresses his heartfelt thanks to Van for saving their lives. He then shares something troubling. It turns out this wasn't the first time their village had been attacked. In fact, this year alone, it's happened more than once. According to Rhonda, things were far safer when their village was still under Ferdinando County. Back then, the area was patrolled by knights who acted as a strong deterrent against bandits. But now, those patrols are long gone, and with them, the village's only real line of defense. Van lowers his head and apologizes to Rhonda and the others for the state they've been left in. He explains that this situation likely arose because the current Marcus has no idea what conditions are like in these smaller, out-of-the-way villages. But now that Van has been appointed as their new lord, he swears not to turn a blind eye to their struggles. He goes on to outline 3 possible paths they can take to secure their future. The first is to produce something valuable enough that the kingdom itself wouldn't dare ignore them. The second is to raise enough money to hire mercenaries for protection. And the third is to focus on building the village up from within, strengthening their infrastructure and community to stand strong on their own. But before the villagers can react, a young girl in the crowd speaks up. She says they've already considered those options in the past. While they sound promising, she explains the reality is much harsher. They found that putting such plans into action is far more difficult than it sounds. Van does his best to rally their spirits, promising that things will be different now that he's here. He assures them that he won't just talk about change, he'll make it happen. Still, his words alone don't seem to sway the villagers, many of whom remain unsure. Sensing their doubt, Esparta and Dee step forward. Standing tall, they formally introduce themselves. Dee as the kingdom's chief commander and Esparta as the royal head butler. With firm voices, they back Van's declaration and promise the villagers that this isn't some empty gesture. They assure Rhonda and the others that with them here, there's no reason to fear anything. Hearing the support of Dee and Esparta lifts the villagers' spirits right away, but it doesn't take long before another concern surfaces. One of them steps forward and hastily asks what will be done about taxes, explaining how hard it's been just to survive while giving up 30% of their harvest every season. Without skipping a beat, Van answers that starting immediately, the tax rate will be lowered to just 10%. He calmly explains that ensuring a safe, livable environment comes first, everything else can wait. The villagers go silent, stunned by the sudden generosity. A cut that deep to less than a third of what they used to pay is something they never imagined possible. Gratitude quickly spreads among the crowd, and for the first time in a while, their hope feels real. As for the village's safety, Esparta wastes no time and conjures a thick, reinforced stone wall that surrounds the entire settlement, standing tall as a bulwark against any future attacks. Then he mentions that adding a moat would strengthen their defenses even further. Dee and the knights step in right after, volunteering to dig it out themselves. Van turns back to the villagers and tells them clearly that if they're willing to work together, he's confident they can transform this place into something far greater than it's ever been. Once things calm down, Van decides to test his production magic again. After a bit of focus, he crafts several wooden-looking blocks, but they're far from ordinary. These are made of nanofibers, a rare and ridiculously tough material. When Ortho tries slamming one with his sword, the blade bounces off without even leaving a scratch. Encouraged by the result, Van spends the rest of the day crafting weapons, each one as polished and precise as a royal armory piece. Watching him work, Tilly starts to worry he might burn himself out, but Van just smiles and assures her he's fine. He remembers reading that production magic usually eats through mana like crazy, and most people struggle to make even a single object without passing out, so clearly Van's built a talent for it. As a finishing touch, he crafts a beautiful sword and offers it to Kamzin, who accepts it with both hands, promising to cherish it for the rest of his life. Tilly gets jealous, so Van hands her an axe, but one glance at her face makes it obvious she's not thrilled. That night, Van rests by the campfire, but his whole body aches from sleeping rough. Glancing at Tilly and Kamzin as they sleep, he can tell they've been putting on a brave face, but they're exhausted too. That's when he makes up his mind, it's time to build a real home. The following morning, Van gets to work. Using the nanoblocks, he and the others begin laying out the foundation. When Chief Rhonda passes by and sees the progress, he remarks that it's shaping up to be a perfect location for the Lord's mansion, and hearing that makes Van's heart swell with pride. He takes a moment to analyze the structure with his magic, carefully measuring the layout and scanning each block down to the last inch. Once everything feels right, Van activates his magic in full. In the blink of an eye, the entire structure assembles itself in front of their eyes, a fully built mansion rising from the ground like a miracle. Everyone stares in wide-eyed silence, unable to process what they just witnessed. Van glances up at the massive building, scratching his head a little, thinking that maybe he went just a little overboard. Nobody can wrap their heads around how Van managed to build an entire mansion in such a short amount of time. It's almost too absurd to believe, and the general consensus becomes clear that his production magic is way more valuable for managing a territory than any flashy elemental spell could ever be. Van admits it's a neat ability, but deep down, he still believes offensive magic is the real key to keeping people safe. In his mind, a powerful lord with the strength to protect is what gives people peace of mind. But his friends shut that down real quick. Esparta points out that while that might be true during times of war, what people really want is a lord who will improve their day-to-day lives. And in that sense, he says no one fits the role better than Van. What Van just pulled off was nothing short of miraculous, and Orthos straight up says that his powers are way beyond anything a normal production magic user could ever dream of. But Van isn't stopping there. He says if they bring him enough lumber, he can build houses for everyone. The others are floored, and Ortho and Dee immediately order their men to start hauling in materials. The villagers, of course, are all in. Their homes are falling apart anyway, and Van quickly realizes he may have just volunteered himself for a massive workload. Still, seeing the conditions they're living in, he makes up his mind to transform the entire village from the ground up. He agrees to build a home for every single family, and the celebration kicks off right away. Van gets to work, cranking out house after house, and people can't believe how much mana he's burning through like it's nothing. Even more impressive is his knowledge of urban planning. He explains the grid layout he's using, with each unit made of 4 houses and wide roads running between each block. It's efficient, clean, and organized. Van says these wooden homes will do for now, but once they have a steady supply of stone, he'll upgrade them all to suit each family's needs. And because he wanted to enjoy a proper bath himself, he went ahead and built a bathhouse next to his mansion, keeping the design simple, while Pluriel helped out by filling the tub with water magic. Later, after taking a bath, Van finally gets to crash in a proper bed, clean and satisfied. The following day, Van finds out the knights managed to dig a trench around the entire village. He's impressed, but notes that filling it with water would make it even better, a full moat for defense. Plus, they'll need a proper water source for drinking and bathing, and that locks in their next goal. Without missing a beat, Van says it's time to secure a water source. Thanks to Esparta's insane strength, they're able to divert water from a nearby river in no time. He digs a solid few meters of trench instantly, while Dee and the rest help extend it by hand. Van followed close behind, reinforcing the bottom and sides of the canal to make sure it wouldn't collapse. The distance between the river and the village was no joke, and Tilly couldn't help but point out how massive a job this really was. Still, Van just shrugs it off because people need water, plain and simple. It's grueling work, but there's something uplifting about seeing everyone come together and push for the same goal. Besides, once the infrastructure is solid and life in the village becomes more stable, it'll be way easier for merchants to stop by. And for Van, that's crucial because if trade picks up, he might finally get to enjoy the slow, peaceful lifestyle he's been dreaming of. He estimates the canal work will take about a week, but then one of the workers casually mentions they can already see the village from where they're digging. That completely catches Van off guard, so he calls it a day right then, thinking the crew could use some rest, but Dee is still raring to go. He insists they could hit the village in just a few more hours if they keep pushing, but Van notices how drained the others are and tells Dee to chill. No sense in knocking everyone out cold. Dee admits this whole thing feels like a new form of training, but even he realizes they shouldn't push past their limits. By the next morning, Van proudly announces that the canal is officially done. He gathers everyone together, thanks them for their hard work, and gives Esparta the signal to open the water gate. A rush of clean river water flows in, and the villagers look on in awe. The moat is now fully operational, surrounding the village and adding a serious layer of defense. Van can't help but worry that it might overflow during heavy rain, so he floats the idea of building a lake behind the village to handle the excess. Esparta actually thinks it's a great idea. A lake could double as a reservoir for dry seasons too. Van jumps on it immediately, getting to work and creating a proper water source that shocks the entire village. Just like that, a place that used to have no water system now has a freaking lake. Thanks to Van, the villagers no longer need to hike out to the river every day just to fill their buckets. The village chief tries to thank him, but Van waves it off. He's just happy that life is finally starting to feel manageable for everyone here. Later that night, we shift scenes to a girl named Lady Arte, traveling alongside someone called Panamra. They're making their way toward a distant frontier village, and while the journey's still far from over, Panamra suggests that Arte should get some rest before they continue. The following morning, Van wraps up construction on a massive defensive wall known as the Rampart. What used to be nothing more than a plain dirt barrier has now transformed into a seriously solid structure. With a wide enough top to allow patrolling, the guards can now walk across it like it's a fortress wall. Everyone's buzzing with excitement because this thing is no joke. It's so sturdy that even if bandits show up, the villagers won't have to lose sleep over it. But Van is not content just yet. He wants to push it even further and make the village feel completely untouchable. Van then experiments with crafting simple crossbows, or at least that's what he calls them. But when he's done, nobody can believe what they're seeing. These things are anything but basic. They're clean, powerful, and even come equipped with shields on the front, letting guards shoot while staying safely behind cover. The moment they see these, everyone realizes just how insane Van's production magic really is. Their village may be tiny, but it's starting to resemble a fully fortified city. Everyone's in full agreement that some random bandit gang wouldn't stand a chance no matter how bold they get. Dee even jokes that if the king had half a clue about what Van was capable of, he wouldn't have kicked him out to this backwater place. He would put him in charge of the entire family. The king may have dismissed him as weak, but one glance at the changes in this village makes it obvious Van's strength isn't just practical, it's battle-ready. Dee insists that Van might be stronger than anyone they've ever seen, while Esparta argues his real talent lies in defense. The two start bickering, but Van steps in and calms them down. He reminds them there's no point in complaining about how things turned out. They've got what they've got, so they'd better make it work and stand tall. Right then, Van's stomach growls like it's declaring war, so Tilly heads off to cook something for the crew. But it's a struggle because supplies are running low. Esparta mentions that while defense is great and all, they need to figure out a steady income source for the village. Right now, they're cut off from the world aside from a couple of merchants who show up once a month. Van brushes it off at first, thinking their crops can handle the village's needs. But then Esparta mentions something critical. They don't have the ingredients to make Van's favorite sweet baked treats. That gets his attention fast because the idea of living without those sweets is basically a nightmare. So Van instantly does a 180 and declares that it's time to come up with a solid product the village can sell. Kamsin then suggests selling the wood blocks that Van crafts with his magic, but Van instantly shuts that idea down. No one else can manipulate them the way he can, so it wouldn't work. One by one, the others pitch in their ideas, but Van can already tell that finding something unique and valuable enough to market as this village's specialty won't be easy. Afterward, Van finds out that Tilly and Kamsin have been avoiding using their weapons. Since they were gifts from him, neither of them wants to risk damaging them. But Van reminds them that the whole point of having weapons is to know how to fight with them, so they've got to get some practice in. Zara tells him not to stress and shows them the shield made from the Orc Knight. It's both tough and flexible, so it won't mess up their weapons too badly even when he blocks. Kamsin steps up first and his swing has no power behind it at all, yet somehow the shield gets knocked to the ground, sliced clean in two. Everyone just stares because a hit with zero force shouldn't do that kind of damage, and the fact that a wooden sword could do that kind of damage with a half-hearted swing stuns everyone, Van included. Van patches up the shield, and not long after, Ortho shows up to see what the fuss is about. He's carrying some ores they recently mined and wants to know if Van is interested in buying them. Ortho explains that the woods around the nearby mountains are crawling with dangerous monsters, which is why most folks avoid the area. But since no one's been mining there, the place is rich with untouched resources. They came back with iron, copper, silver, and even a little gold. But what really catches Van off guard is when Ortho says they found mithril ore. If that's just from the foothills, then the deeper mountain range must be packed with valuable materials. Van takes a bit of the iron ore and stuns the group by instantly turning it into a solid block of metal. He admits he didn't refine it before molding it, so he's not sure how pure the result is. Still, Zara's hyped and asks if Van can forge him a sword out of it. Feeling a little guilty about the busted shield, Van agrees. Zara requests both a long sword and a short one, so Van gets started. It's his first time crafting with iron, so he really has to focus. He carefully visualizes the design and edge, and before long, he finishes. And since Zara is his very first customer, Van even put in extra effort to make the swords look great. Zara's thrilled with the short sword, and Van moves on to the next. It turns out just as good, and now all the other adventurers are lining up, wanting weapons of their own. Van reminds them that since they're the ones who gathered the ores, it's only fair he makes their gear. Once he's done, it's obvious to everyone that Van could easily sell these weapons for a fortune. Then he shifts his gaze to the mithril ore, wondering just how incredible a weapon made from that would turn out. Esparta is immediately fascinated by the mithril, mostly because he's never heard of metallic ores being mined in a forest. The only logical explanation is that there's a dungeon nearby. He tells Van that if they manage to locate one, everything about their situation would flip overnight. A steady stream of people, trade, and opportunity would flood in, turning their quiet little village into a bustling hub. That possibility gets Van fired up because finding a dungeon would skyrocket the village's value and status. Dungeons are packed with high-grade resources and gems that can rival national treasures. Normally, whenever the guild catches wind of a new dungeon, they rush to establish a branch in the nearest settlement. But Van brings up the hard truth. The village just isn't equipped to handle that kind of influx right now. Esparta agrees, since bringing in the guild would mean waves of adventurers, merchants, and even knights showing up. And with their current setup, they barely have the food, space, or infrastructure to support any of them. Worse, if word got out too soon, a rival country might try to invade, hoping to snatch control of the dungeon before the village can do anything about it. And then there's Van's personal dilemma. He's considered a disgrace by his family, so if his father finds out that the village he was exiled to actually has value, there's no doubt he'd be shipped off somewhere else. That's why Van decides they need to develop the village and produce results first, before any dungeon discovery changes the game. Ortho totally gets it. He says they'll steer clear of the suspected dungeon area while gathering materials just to be safe. Van knows the adventurers could easily report this and gain favor with the guild, so he genuinely respects that they're holding back to protect the village. Sometime later, Van looks around, satisfied with the progress they've made. He smiles and says their dramatic village makeover is officially complete. Tilly stares at him, half in disbelief, and asks if he's seriously not out of mana yet after cranking out weapons and houses non-stop. But Van just waves it off, saying he's only a little worn out. Right then, a breathless messenger rushes in with urgent news. Armored lizards are headed straight for the village. Van doesn't hesitate and shouts for everyone to get behind the walls, orders the drawbridge raised, and has the gates sealed. The villagers are visibly shaken. They've all heard how deadly those creatures can be, and panic spreads fast. But Van stays calm. He knows fear is natural, but reminds them that the lives of their friends and families depend on what they choose to do now. He promises to fight for them all, but he's also honest. He can't do this alone. That's why he asks them to stand with him. If they want to keep this village safe, they'll need to fight for it. The villagers rally behind Van's speech, fired up and dead set on defending their home with everything they've got. Van doesn't waste a second. He orders them straight to the walls and has them take positions behind the ballistae. Kamsin informs him that Ortho and his team are out on a hunt, meaning someone has to step up and lead, so Van chooses to stay behind with his people. But before he can move, Tilly grabs his arm, eyes welling up with tears. Van isn't the type to fold over emotions, but he's not about to shake her off either, so he quickly turns to D and tells him to get up top and keep him updated on the situation as it unfolds. Van remains on the ground, barking out commands while D rushes to the wall and freezes in disbelief at what he sees. He radios back to Van, reporting that a swarm of around 40 armored lizards is closing in fast. Each one towers at about 8 meters, practically 3 elephants stacked in a trench coat. D's nerves start to crack because he knows even a squad of elite knights would struggle with one of these monsters, and right now, they're severely outmanned. Van orders him to load the iron bolts into the heavy ballistae, and D jumps to it without hesitation. The knights nearby warn him that normal weapons are useless against those rock-hard scales, and D knows that damn well. But still, he decides to trust Van's call. For once, he puts his instincts aside and lets Van take the reins. He shouts for everyone to ready their shots and gives the order to fire. The bolts slam into the monsters and disappear. For a second, D thinks they've failed, but then he sees clean, gaping holes where the arrows struck. The hulking lizards take a few staggering steps before collapsing under their own momentum. Just in that opening barrage, 10 of them drop. These floored by the sheer firepower of Van's gear. Wasting no time, he rallies the team for another volley. But the knights quickly tell him they've only got one more iron bolt per launcher. D doesn't flinch, and he tells them to reload and shoot anyway, and once again, they nail several more targets. But it's not enough because half the lizards are still marching, and now they're out of ammo. D reports back, and Van instantly starts working through the problem. That's when it hits him. Kamzin's wooden sword had sliced clean through Zara's top-tier shield, so maybe those wooden bolts might do the trick. He tells D to switch to the wooden ones. The knights look at him like he's lost his mind because wood against armor thicker than steel is suicide. D shuts them down hard, telling them to quit whining because Van's already proven himself more than once, and right now, he's putting his full faith in the guy. He orders the villagers to load the wooden bolts and fire. To everyone's shock, even the wooden arrows sink halfway into the beasts. That alone is enough to hit something vital and drop them instantly. D realizes right then that there's no stopping them, so he roars out for another round, declaring that tonight they'll be dining on fresh lizard steak. The villagers waste no time, raining down bolt after bolt, finishing off whatever's still breathing. D announces their win to Van and the rest of the crew. Cheers erupt from the crowd as Tilly rushes over and clings to Van, while he's still trying to wrap his head around the fact that his wooden gear actually took down monsters built like tanks. Up on the wall, the knights can't believe their luck, no injuries, and still plenty of ammo in stock. D feels a weird mix of pride and letdown because the fight ended way too fast, but all that really proves is how busted Van's creations are. A little while later, Ortho's party finally gets back and takes charge of breaking down the fallen beasts. Ortho tells everyone to salvage the good stuff, their eyes, fangs, scales, and magic cores for selling, but the meat will be stored for food. Normally, carving up armored lizards is a long, grueling job that ends with half the meat rotting. But with Van's specially made knives, they're cutting through like butter. Right around then, Van shows up, inspects the massive pile of meat, and decides to throw a feast to celebrate. Once night falls, the village comes alive with celebration. Everyone's eating their fill of lizard meat. Ortho's crew joins Van and tells him that the weapons he crafted for them are absolutely killing it in the field. D catches that and raises an eyebrow, asking if Van gave them gear before making anything for him. Ortho's guys start flexing their swords like proud kids on Christmas morning. D, not hiding his jealousy, begs Van to make him a sword too, and says he'll literally write him a blank check. The other knights quickly jump in, wanting their own weapons as well. Van, a little flustered, tells them he can't take their money and he's kind of swamped right now. But he promises to hook them up with new equipment once things settle down in the village, and the knights are more than happy with that. Afterward, Ortho gives Van the breakdown that normally each armored lizard goes for about 20 gold coins, but since a chunk of the meat always rots, they'll get closer to 8 coins apiece. Even then, that's a fat stack of cash. Van starts sweating at the thought of managing all that gold because it's more than he's ever dealt with in his life. Esparta hits him with a gut punch. Apparently, once a village earns more than 100 gold coins, they're legally bound to cough up half of it to the marquis and taxes. Van feels like he just got rug-pulled in some shady crypto scheme and immediately asks if there's a loophole they can abuse to dodge the taxman. Esparta shuts him down, saying there's no way to hide that much monster loot, and Van slumps, already imagining his father catching wind of the village's value and shipping him off to some forgotten corner of the map. But just then, Esparta sparks up with an idea. What if they just report to Murcia instead of Halpa? Van catches on fast that if they hand over the credit for the armored lizard massacre to his older brother, they can keep flying under the radar and stick around here a little longer. The very next day, a pair of merchants roll into the village, and the second they lay eyes on the towering fortress walls, they start arguing over who messed up the map and sent them off track. That's when Van casually steps onto the gate and welcomes them like a proper lord. The two merchants freeze, completely stunned. They recognize Van instantly, the prodigy son of the Marquis, and are baffled as hell to find him holed up in the middle of nowhere. They introduce themselves as Bell and Rango from the Merry Chamber of Commerce, and Van opens the gates to let them in. Once they reach the warehouse and catch sight of the piles of armored lizard materials, their jaws just about hit the ground. They can't wrap their heads around how this tiny village bagged so many monsters. But Van cuts to the chase and asks if they're interested in buying the goods. Without missing a beat, the merchants say yes, but they'll need a month to bring a crew to appraise and transport the haul. Van's cool with that and even tells them to take some meat on the house since it'll spoil anyway. He then walks them over to a stash of weapons up for grabs, and the quality hits them like a truck. They immediately agree to his price, no haggling, no questions. Van just tells them to spread the word. That's when the brothers start hesitating, clearly thinking they can keep the place under wraps and make a killing by cornering the sword market. Van sees right through them and tells them straight that trying to keep it secret won't work. People will figure it out the moment they track the merchant's travel route. The brothers blink in shock, and Van throws them a better pitch. If they really want to rake in cash, they should open up shop right here in the village. The brothers jump at the offer without a second thought, bowing deeply in front of Van to show their thanks. But before they can even process what's happening, Van casually tells them to start building their shop immediately. Then, with a smug grin, he snaps his fingers and conjures the exact store they'd always dreamed of owning. He pats them on the back and says he's looking forward to doing some solid business together. Not long after, Van gets a surprise visit from two unexpected guests. One is a noble girl around his age, and the other is a total warrior queen of a knight, standing guard beside her. The Night Lady instantly starts judging everything and makes it clear she's here to figure out if Van's really a prodigy or just another overhyped fraud. At the same time, Van's dealing with a whole different headache. Esparta just handed him an assignment to design a city fit for 10,000 people. With the way the village is growing, it won't be long before they're running a full-blown metropolis. Esparta asks what kind of fortress Van has in mind, noting that square-shaped layouts are the standard. But Van's never been one to do things by the book. He says he wants a star-shaped fortress instead. That way, invaders will be forced to waste time trying to hit multiple defensive points scattered across the structure. Esparta actually likes the concept and jumps in to help with the planning, but then their brainstorm gets cut short. The Redhead Knight storms into the room and announces that someone from Ferdinando County is requesting a meeting. Van gives the okay, and sure enough, it's the same noble girl and the Night Lady from before. He welcomes them properly, and the knight steps forward to introduce herself as Panamra, a former knight who earned the title of Viscountess through pure grit. The girl quietly introduces herself as Arte, the youngest daughter of Count Ferdinando, and Van politely offers them seats. Panamra dives straight into business and asks Van if he knows why they're here. He guesses they came to evaluate him, and if they find him useful or dangerous, they'll try to bring him over to their side. She laughs out loud, impressed he hit the nail on the head. She explains that Count Ferdinando suspects Mark Halpa sent his star child here to claim new territory, but she personally believes it's the opposite, that Van was dumped here because he doesn't have any elemental magic. Van decides to be honest. He admits that yeah, he's got no elemental powers, and no, he's not leading some invasion. He was flat out exiled by his own father. But Panamra raises an eyebrow. After all, no powerless exile could have developed this place so quickly. She says it looks like he showed up with 5,000 soldiers and turned the village into a mini military outpost. Van bursts into laughter, then apologizes and tells her the truth. He was kicked out of the family with just his bags and a good luck, and not a single person came to say goodbye. Panamra glances around and sarcastically asks if she's hallucinating the butler and knight commander in the corner. D answers first, explaining he chose to train Van on his own and has been ignoring orders to return to the capital. Esparta follows up, saying he's retired now and is teaching Van just for fun. Then Tilly chimes in, saying she'll serve Van forever because he treats everyone with respect, no matter their background. But even with all that, it still doesn't explain the crazy fast progress, and Van knows it, so he tells them to hold tight. A live demonstration will be quicker than a long-winded explanation. He leads them outside the village and asks Esparta to raise an earthen wall, planning to upgrade it into something worthy of a fortress. Panamra is surprised by the old butler's skill, but points out the wall won't last long once the mana fades. Van doesn't waste a second and taps into his magic and hardens the mud wall into reinforced concrete, then uses wood nanocubes to slap together a proper gate. Panamra and Arte are left blinking in disbelief. They turn to Van and ask what kind of magic he's packing. He tells them it's production magic, the kind of magic everyone laughs at, which is exactly why he got dumped in this village. That hits a nerve for Arte, who quietly remembers her own rough past. Before the mood sinks, Panamra brings up her real reason for coming. She says the Count sent her to propose a marriage between Van and Arte. Van gets the message loud and clear. This is the Count's way of roping him in, so he won't end up becoming a threat. Van politely turns her down, saying there's no need for marriage since he has zero interest in war. All he wants is to build up the village and live in peace. Panamra admits she was against the idea at first. Arte marrying the lord of some backwater village sounded like a nightmare. But now that she's seen what Van is capable of, she's changed her mind. She starts showering him with praise, calling him sharp, dependable, and tough as nails for turning exile into opportunity. She even jokes that if it were allowed, she'd marry him herself. Van lights up at the thought of scoring a hot older waifu, but sadly, it's Arte or bust. Panamra looks at Arte and gently asks if she'd consider marrying Van after all guys like him don't grow on trees. Arte turns red and admits that Van's a good man, but she's never really thought about marriage before. Van tells her not to rush it. This kind of decision isn't something to wing in one night. Panamra agrees, saying they'll spend the night in the village to think things over. That throws Van off, but when she asks if there's a guest room in the mansion, he ditches that idea and decides to just build them a whole den in instead. Later at dinner, Van decides to learn more about his potential bride-to-be. Arte tells him she's into cute stuff, like flowers and dolls. Van smiles and asks if he can check out her collection. Arte lights up and happily agrees to show him the dolls in her carriage. It's the first time in a while someone's taken real interest in her. Afterward, Van walks them to the inn and Panamra quietly steps away, leaving the two alone. Arte tells Van he's sweet, then dashes into her room all flustered. Van heads back to the mansion, where Esparta tells him something that clicks hard. Since the Count was willing to marry off his daughter to a nobody, she's probably not an elemental mage either. That's when it hits Van. Arte must have been cast out too. Whether or not they end up getting engaged, he decides she can stay in the village if she wants to. The following morning, Van gets shaken awake by Tilly and Kamzin. They're buzzing with urgency, telling him to come to the lake immediately because they saw something weird. Van isn't too thrilled about being dragged out of bed at such an early hour, but after enough nagging, he groans, gets up, and follows them. When they arrive, a small crowd of villagers is already gathered by the lake shore. Van pushes through the group and stops in his tracks. Floating in the water is a mermaid-like figure, her head poking above the surface, calmly watching them. Esparta steps forward and explains that the creature is called an apkalu, an extremely rare species that most people never encounter in their lives. Van starts wondering what could possibly draw one of them here. He tries talking to her, but she doesn't respond, just keeps staring, unreadable. Figuring food might help break the ice, Van places a plate of meat near the water's edge. Instantly, she swims over and asks if she can have it. Van nods and she eagerly grabs a piece. After taking a bite, she pauses, noticing right away that this isn't normal meat, it's from an armored lizard. Curious, she asks where the meat came from and who killed the beast. The villagers speak up before Van can say anything, proudly announcing that he was the one who brought it down, though Van would have never bragged himself. Hearing this, the apkalu girl says nothing more. She suddenly dips back beneath the surface and disappears into the depths. Esparta watches her vanish and mentions that ekalas are rarely seen twice, so it's unlikely they'll return. But as it turns out, Esparta couldn't have been more wrong. The very next day, an entire group of apkalu arrives at the lake, their presence turning heads and dropping jaws. Van is stunned, wondering if they showed up because word got out that he took down the armored lizards. He starts thinking maybe they saw those creatures as sacred or divine in some way, but Esparta quickly shuts that theory down, saying he's never heard of any belief like that. Then a towering, imposing apkalu steps forward and says he wants to speak with Van directly. He asks him straight up if he was really the one who killed the armored lizards. And when Van confirms it, a wave of gasps ripples through the water as every apkalu stares at him in disbelief. It's hard for them to imagine a boy his age pulling off something like that. The elder then introduces himself as Latavesta, ruler of the apkalu. He reveals that the girl Van met yesterday is his daughter Priora, and without skipping a beat, he declares that he's offering her to Van as his bride. Van is left completely stunned, especially since Priora is clearly still a child and likely has no idea what marriage even is. Van looks at Latavesta and asks if there's a particular reason behind offering his daughter's hand in marriage. Latavesta nods, confirming there is. He begins explaining that their village has long been tormented by armored lizards, dangerous creatures that have made life difficult and frightening for his people. So when he heard about a powerful lord living in this settlement, someone strong enough to defeat those monsters, he thought it was only right to offer his daughter's hand. Not out of sentiment, but to form a lasting alliance, one that would safeguard his village through strength and partnership. As Van listens, it slowly clicks. This wasn't about personal feelings or family tradition. Latavesta was simply doing what he thought necessary to protect his people. Understanding that, Van tells him there's no need for a marriage. He gives his word that he'll do everything in his power to protect the apkalas from danger, no strings attached. Latavesta stares at him, visibly caught off guard by the sincerity and maturity of Van's response. Still, he says that if Van truly means it, they'd like to move their entire village closer into the settlement for safety and easier cooperation. Van doesn't hesitate and immediately gets to work constructing a large rest area just for them, somewhere comfortable, peaceful, and welcoming. When Latavesta sees the finished space, he's stunned. The size, the structure, the planning, he can't believe it was built so fast. It's more than just a resting area, it's a new home. The apkalas soon begin settling in and making the most of it, enjoying the comfort and relief that's been missing from their lives for years. But just as things seem to be calming down, Esparta walks up to Van with a reminder that it's nearly time to handle the village's sewage system. Van just chuckles and waves it off, saying it's all been prepared ahead of time. Underneath every home, a network of pipes has been installed, and all they have to do is release a stream of water from the lake to flush everything clean. Latavesta watches the whole thing unfold and finds it surprisingly clever. He's impressed by the efficiency of Van's plan and offers to lend a hand. Van politely declines, saying the apkalas have just arrived and shouldn't be bothered with chores right away. But Latavesta insists, saying their people are gifted with water and managing flow systems is second nature. Van finally agrees, and some of the apkalas step in to open the dam and guide the water through, flushing the waste and leaving the village spotless. Once the work is finished, Van sincerely thanks everyone for their help. Latavesta then points out that this flushing process needs to be done several times throughout the day. He suggests that the apkalas handle it regularly as their way of contributing to the village while staying there. Van immediately agrees, thinking it is a great idea and a huge help, and thanks Latavesta again for being so considerate. At that moment, Arte and Panamra arrive at the lake. They freeze in shock when they see Latavesta, having never seen an apkalu in person before. Just before Latavesta leaves, he casually refers to Van as his son-in-law. Arte instantly feels a twinge of jealousy, since it sounds like Van has already married an apkalu. Van hurriedly denies it and tries to explain, but before he can finish, Priora suddenly pops out of the water, calls Van her husband, and quickly swims away, making the situation far more awkward than it already was. To clear up the misunderstanding, Van takes Arte out on a quiet boat ride across the lake. He explains everything to her, reassuring her that nothing has happened between him and Priora. After listening, Arte finally understands that it was all just a big misunderstanding. The two spend a short while talking calmly and enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. Suddenly, Priora swims over with a group of her friends. When she sees Van alone with Arte, she becomes visibly jealous. Van quickly reminds her that they are not married to begin with, which upsets her, and she sinks back into the water in frustration. The other Apcalis notice that their princess is unhappy, so they begin rocking the boat side to side. Both Van and Arte panic as the boat sways dangerously. Later on, Latavesta puts on a stern expression after hearing that Van was spending time with Arte while Priora was nearby. Van tries to explain that he and Priora are not engaged, but Latavesta cuts him off. He proposes settling the issue with a competition. He declares that if the Apcalis win, Van will officially become engaged to Priora, but Van thinks the whole idea is absurd. Right then, Dee appears and accepts the challenge on the spot, openly daring anyone to challenge him. The rest of the group, eager to beat the Apcalis once and for all, immediately supports the idea. Before long, they manage to pressure Van into agreeing. Van is then given the right to choose the first contest, and he suggests a simple game of volleyball. No one there has ever seen or even heard of the game before, so they assume it is just another one of Van's strange but clever inventions. Dee and Panamera, however, seem far more interested in the swimsuits than the actual game. With that, the first match is set, with Tilly and Panamera facing off against Latavesta and Priora. Once the game starts, Van is quickly caught off guard by how skilled the Apcalis are. They are far better than he expected, winning round after round and overwhelming the human team with ease. Tilly starts feeling discouraged and considers giving up, but Panamera gives her a few sharp words to keep her going. Regaining their focus, the two manage to score several points, bringing the match close to its final moments. Even so, their effort and teamwork are not enough to overcome the Apcalis. In the end, Latavesta and Priora win the first round without question. Since Van selected the previous challenge, Latavesta reminds him that it is now the Apcalis' turn to choose the next event. Latavesta immediately suggests a swimming relay race. The moment Van hears this, he realizes just how unfair it is. The Apcalis are natural swimmers, and they would clearly have the advantage. Pressure starts to weigh on him, knowing that losing could mean being forced into marriage with Priora. At that moment, Dee steps forward and volunteers to swim for Van's team. Kamsin quickly follows, offering to join as well, giving Van two strong competitors. The race begins, and Kamsin pushes himself to keep pace with Priora. She is incredibly fast, but Kamsin fights hard and even pulls ahead of her briefly before passing the lead to Dee. Dee takes over and instantly turns the tide. His powerful butterfly strokes launch him far ahead, leaving the Apcalis struggling to close the distance. Van watches in disbelief as Dee swims flawlessly and secures the victory. Latavesta is stunned, unable to understand how his team could lose despite being part fish and naturally gifted swimmers. Still, he refuses to give up, pointing out that there is one final contest left to decide the outcome. Now it is Van's turn to choose the next challenge. Taking a moment to think, he accepts the earlier win and quickly creates an ice maker. He then announces that the final event will be a shaved ice speed-eating contest. Arte realizes she has not taken part in any of the competitions yet and immediately volunteers, and Van also steps forward to join her in the challenge. They all head over to the resting area to start the challenge. At first, everyone takes a few spoonfuls of shaved ice and is immediately hit with painful brain freezes, but they grit their teeth and keep going anyway. Van is fully determined to avoid marrying Priora, while Arte is just as determined to win for Van's sake, and that shared resolve pushes them forward. Working together, they manage to finish first, claiming a clear victory in the contest. Showing good sportsmanship, Latavesta swims up and offers Van a handshake before leaving. Even so, he still refers to Van as his son-in-law and reminds him to look after Priora. Van feels irritated, realizing that even after winning, Latavesta still talks as if the marriage is unavoidable. At the same time, the others crowd around Van, congratulating him and praising his efforts. Arte watches as he is surrounded by smiles and admiration, and something stirs inside her. She has never experienced a moment like this before. As a child, her parents constantly ignored her, believing she was a failure. She was shy and never stood out at anything, but that only changed when she discovered marionette magic, which allowed her to freely control her dolls. For the first time, she hoped her mother would finally be proud of her. Instead, her mother slapped her and declared that puppet magic was evil and forbidden among nobles. After that, Arte became an outcast, and when she turned 10, she was arranged to be engaged to Van. She had expected him to be no different from the arrogant nobles she had known before, but Van proved to be nothing like them. He was gentle, patient, and possessed a strange talent for production magic, something nobles dismissed as useless. Even so, Van believed in himself and used that magic to support the village and its people. Watching him now, Arte realizes she wants to become someone like him. She convinces herself that if she keeps trying, she might one day see the world the way Van does. The following morning, Van gathers all the villagers for a meeting. He announces that they need to build additional ramp sections to support the village's future growth. He also adds that since the next day will be their day off, they will be holding a large barbecue that night. The news excites everyone, and the villagers immediately get back to work with renewed energy. At that moment, Arte approaches Van and asks if she can observe him while he works. Van agrees, giving her the chance to learn by watching him. At the same time, deep within the forest, Ortho and the other adventurers are fleeing from something powerful and dangerous, signaling that another major threat is drawing closer. Meanwhile, in the village, no one had a clue what was unfolding outside. They were too caught up admiring the massive fortifications Van had finished in under 2 weeks. The walls stood tall and solid, radiating strength, and everyone was honestly blown away by how fast he pulled it off. Panamera strolled over, visibly stunned, and admitted she always believed Van had potential, but she never pictured him pulling off something on this scale. As she stepped closer, her legendary melon bounced slightly, making Van shoot her a quick, startled glance. Not wanting to dwell on it, he quickly changed the subject, saying he needed to oversee the construction of new homes since more settlers were heading their way. Merchants, adventurers, and travelers would soon pour in, and he wanted to be sure they'd have proper housing. Panamera confessed she felt a bit envious. Ever since she was young, she dreamed of owning land somewhere she could truly call hers. Watching Van manage everything so confidently sparked something in her. She didn't just want coin from her next mission. She wanted to earn a piece of land she could command. She silently vowed that in the next major battle, she'd fight harder, not just for glory or gold, but to stake her own claim. As her eyes wandered, they locked onto the massive siege weapons mounted along the walls. Curious, she asked Van what they were. He explained they were ballistae, giant long-range weapons meant to blast enemies before they ever got close to the village. To prove their might, Van signaled Kamzan to fire one off. The projectile launched with explosive force, hammering forward with thousands of mutants behind it, and Panamera was completely floored. She never imagined something Van had engineered could hit that hard, but what stunned her even more was finding out he'd already built over 100 of them. Instantly, she asked what he'd charge for just one, clearly interested in having one of her own. But Van simply shook his head. They weren't for sale, and that alone caught her off guard again. Still, she wasn't giving up, so she offered to trade him a favor for one, anything he might ask down the line. Van agreed, saying he'd cash in on it when the time came, and a thrill of anticipation ran through her. She knew the ballistae were bulky and would need a cart just to move, but with the bolts forged from iron, she figured she could always forge more of those herself later. Right then, Kamzan walked up and casually suggested Panamera take 1 or 2 of Van's custom-forged bolts, claiming they weren't your average ammo. To back it up, he pulled out a sword Van had crafted, and without warning, he sliced clean through Panamera's spare blade like it was made of paper. Her eyes flew wide with disbelief and immediately turned to Van, asked what kind of metal could do that. Van calmly explained it was just regular iron, but sharpened and hardened in a way that could even punch through thick, scaled lizard armor. Panamera was left speechless, and without wasting a second, she asked if she could take some of those bolts along with the ballista. Van gave her the green light, letting her have both the siege weapon and the enhanced ammo. That's when Van spun around and spotted Ortho and his squad barreling out of the tree line, full sprint with a massive forest dragon storming right behind them. Ortho shouted at Van and the others, yelling for them to fall back and warn the villagers. He explained they were planning to act as bait to buy everyone else enough time to prepare. Van's blood ran cold. Leaving them behind now would mean sending them to their deaths. He felt torn, maybe they should stay and fight, but the thought of putting the whole village in danger held him back. Panamera stepped forward, calm and unshaken. She told Van not to worry and said flat out that she was staying to help take the dragon down. Then she turned and barked orders for everyone to fall behind the walls and stay sheltered. She also shouted back to Ortho's group, letting them know they'd use the ballista to launch a long-range counterattack. Van made his way over to Arte and quietly apologized for letting her see something so terrifying. But he quickly added that she didn't need to be scared. The upgraded ballista was locked and loaded, and Panamera would be leading the charge. After that, he asked Tilly to get Arte safely behind the walls and told her to summon D and the other fighters for backup. Then, as the dragon finally came into range, the first volley was launched. Bolts and arrows ripped through the sky, yet not a single one landed. The dragon weaved between every shot, dodging effortlessly, making Van's heart drop. Their strongest weaponry wasn't even scratching it, and now he was seriously starting to question whether they could even survive this battle. Then, with a blinding flash and a surge of raw heat, Panamera unleashed her fire magic. A massive javelin of flame shot out from her hand, hurling straight at the forest dragon like a burning spear of death. The spell slammed into it hard, fire ripping across its armored scales and landing a serious hit. Everyone stood frozen, wide-eyed. None of them expected Panamera to be packing that kind of elemental firepower with such deadly precision. But even with that brutal strike, the damned dragon was still standing. The fire javelin had landed clean, scorched its scales good, but the beast didn't drop. Instead, it flapped those scorched wings and came charging through the air again. Van didn't waste a second. He yelled for a full volley, and the soldiers let loose every ballista they had. Several thick bolts tore through the sky, and finally a few managed to punch holes through the dragon's wings. Van caught that and knew they had a shot. If the wings were busted, it might not stay airborne for long. He gave the order for another barrage. The soldiers fired again, but this time the dragon was ready. It shifted in the air, dodging every bolt like it could read the path of each one before it left the launcher, so not a single Dan shot landed. Van was stunned. He didn't expect a beast that huge to be that damn smart or fast. At the same time, Ortho and his group had finally made it past the wall. Just stepping onto safe ground felt like a miracle. Van was relieved they all made it back alive, but he knew staying out here any longer was asking to get roasted. If that dragon came back swinging, they'd all be done. He needed one shot, just one clear window for everyone to get the hell out. And right then, Panamera delivered. She launched another blazing javelin of fire, just as vicious as the first. It slammed right into the dragon again, searing its wings and slowing it down for a brief moment. That was all Van needed, so he instantly shouted for a retreat. Nobody waited and they all turned and sprinted for the village. But the damn dragon didn't stay down for long. The moment it caught its breath, it leaped up and landed on the rampart, towering over them like it hadn't taken a hit at all. Van turned back wide-eyed at how fast it bounced back. After eating that much fire, it should have been wrecked, but it looked like it just shook it off. Then out of nowhere, Esparta strolled up like it was just another day. Calm as ever, he raised his hand and cast an earth spell. Huge chunks of rock crashed down, pinning the dragon in place. He turned to Van, still calm as ever, and said this should buy them enough time to get to the village gate. The others rushed toward the village as fast as their legs could carry them, but Van knew that even with Esparta's help, it still wasn't enough. The dragon was coming fast, and unless they stalled it again, it would be breathing down their necks in no time. So the idiot Van turned around at the village gates and went straight to Panamera, and he told her it was time to cash in that favor. He laid out his plan clearly. Once the forest dragon got close, she'd hit it with a fire javelin to hold it down long enough for the ballistas to land a clean shot and end this for good. Panamera was all in, but when the dragon finally reached the edge of the village, the ballistas still weren't ready. The bolts hadn't been fully loaded yet, and they needed just a little more time. Right then, D and his crew charged out into the open field, weapons in hand, custom high-grade gear Van had forged for them himself. Their mission was simple: buy a few more seconds, and they didn't hesitate. They faced off against the beast, knowing full well they couldn't beat it. The dragon overpowered them in no time, but their brave stand slowed it down just enough. They pulled back to the village barely in one piece, but they'd done their part. Van didn't waste a second and gave the signal, and Panamera instantly launched her fire javelin, slamming it straight into the dragon and locking it in place exactly as planned. And at that same moment, the ballistas finished loading, so the soldiers fired and the massive bolts hit dead on, tearing into the dragon and dealing devastating damage. D moved in cautiously to check if the thing was finally down. It looked lifeless until one of its eyes suddenly snapped open. D didn't flinch, and he reacted fast, raised his sword, and with one clean swing, took the dragon's head off. And just like that, it was over. Cheers erupted around the village. Soldiers and villagers alike shouted in victory, the weight of fear finally lifting. Arte came running up to Van, asking if he was okay. Van nodded and told him he was fine. Then Panamera walked over and gave Van credit for coming up with such a sharp plan at the last second. She admitted something too, that this village, these people, they weren't normal. No regular village would last it against a forest dragon, let alone beaten one. Most would have been torched to ash without even getting a chance to fight. Putting that aside, she told Van they needed to hold a proper dragon slayer ceremony for D and the others. They were the ones who landed the heavy hits, and D was the one who finished it. By tradition, the one who lands the final blow earns the title of Dragon Slayer. Van didn't argue, and he agreed completely. Soon enough, the villagers gathered in the open square for the ceremony. Everyone came out to honor the ones who had risked everything to protect them. Cheers filled the air as Panamera stepped forward and began recognizing each fighter one by one. She praised their courage, their grit, and their refusal to back down even when the odds looked hopeless. Then at the very end, she called Van to the front. She said flat out that if it weren't for his sharp thinking and clever strategy, none of them would even be standing here. The crowd instantly roared with applause, shouting his name in celebration. As Panamera watched Van standing there, she couldn't help but reflect on her own journey, starting way back from her days as a low-tier knight. She'd been born into a proud family of royal knights in the capital, with generations of loyal service behind them. The moment her strong elemental magic surfaced, the county swept her away for military training. From then on, her path was brutal, strict discipline, intense drills, non-stop expectations, but she pushed through it all. And by 16, she had already earned the title of squad commander. She led her troops into countless battles, racking up victory after victory. Her name gained weight, and with each success, her status rose. And eventually, she was awarded noble rank. And after 6 straight years of service, she stood among the few who'd been elevated to the title of Viscountess, personally recognized by the king. Then at one point, she had a formal meeting with the Lord of Ferdinando. He mentioned plans to marry off his youngest daughter, Arte, to some faraway frontier lord. That was Panamera's first link to Arte's future. Honestly, she'd been concerned. The idea of Arte ending up with a weak or clueless man didn't sit right with her. She didn't want the girl to live a miserable life, but everything changed after she met Van. Her doubts vanished, and it was clear just how much Arte had grown under his influence. No longer shy and passive, she had started stepping up, speaking out, showing a kind of quiet strength she'd never had before. And Panamera knew exactly where that change came from. Van wasn't like the other nobles she dealt with, he was something else entirely. Holding on to those thoughts, Panamera turned to face the crowd. Then, in front of everyone and in full authority as a Viscountess of the Noble Empire, she made a bold declaration. She announced that she would form an equal alliance with Van. The words caught Van off guard. He hadn't seen that coming, but as soon as the shock wore off, he understood the weight of it. With his own father having cut him off and his ties to the nobility nearly gone, this was an opportunity that might never come again. He didn't take long to decide, and with a firm nod, he accepted the alliance. And with that, the pact between Van and Viscountess Panamera was sealed. The following morning, Van sits down with Esparta to talk about what comes next for the village, and Esparta tells him that the massive defensive walls he constructed already proved their worth during the clash with the forest dragon. So now it is time to redirect his focus toward proper town development. Van nods in agreement and remembers that Esparta once asked him to create a city capable of supporting 10,000 residents down the line. Esparta confirms it and says they should begin attracting new settlers to increase the village's numbers and gradually elevate it into a full-fledged city. Right at that moment, Tilly walks into the office to inform Van that the merchant brothers Bell and Rango have arrived together with several other traders from their firm. Van feels a surge of excitement to see them and decides to sell off the forest dragon materials first before jumping straight into urban expansion plans. They head over to the storage building where the dragon's harvested resources are stored, and Van asks the brothers how much profit he could realistically expect. They explain that a mature forest dragon is extremely uncommon and highly prized, and on top of that, its scales, talons, and eyes are all in solid condition. They add that even by pricing it cautiously, he could secure 100 platinum coins, which would easily qualify him as a millionaire even back in the real world. At the same time, the older merchants inspect the dragon's remains with sharp eyes and then begin whispering their scheme under their breath. Van walks up to them and asks for their opinion, and they start rubbing their palms together as they urge him to sell every single part of the dragon to them because he will not find superior trade partners anywhere else. They assure him they will present the best offer available and then state that they are willing to pay 60 platinum coins for the entire lot. That figure is noticeably lower than what he heard from the brothers, and he chooses to consult them again before delivering his response. The veteran merchants grow uneasy because the brothers are still inexperienced compared to them and could slip up, so they pull the brothers aside, telling them to cooperate since they all belong to the same company, and that they should squeeze as much gain as possible from this naive youngster. The brothers protest that they ought to give a just price as upright traders, but the seasoned merchants snap at them and tell them to take that righteousness, fold it up, and shove it somewhere unpleasant. They are certain that no competing merchant will bother coming all the way out here and that Van will eventually have to accept whatever rate they dictate. Van hears every word clearly and is ready to confront the senior merchants, but the brothers speak before he can. They boldly announce that they intend to conduct fair and transparent dealings with everyone because they believe it will reward them far more over time, and they are convinced that staying honest with Van is the smartest move they can make. The senior merchants do not take that stance lightly, and they lash out at the rookies, hurling insults and threatening to have them expelled from the respected Merry Chamber of Commerce for failing to prioritize the company's profit. The two money-hungry scumbags storm off after that, and Van turns to the brothers and asks if they are truly going to be thrown out. They admit that it is likely, assuming the executives will favor the seasoned traders over newcomers like them, and that losing membership would cost them a great deal of reputation. Van proposes that they establish their own trading firm instead, and both of them nearly choke when they hear that idea. They explain that launching a company is far from simple and requires clearing three major hurdles. First comes paying the merchant guild's registration costs, then securing a storefront under their own name. Those parts are manageable, but the final requirement is obtaining backing from a noble who holds an official title. Van only knows one titled noble who might assist him, so he immediately approaches Panamera with the request. She agrees to sponsor the brothers without hesitation, and Van urges her to reconsider, since she could provoke conflict with the Merry Chamber of Commerce, which operates under royal patronage. Panamera answers that such a massive enterprise would hardly waste time worrying about a minor noble supporting a tiny two-man venture. Besides, she wants to take actions that enhance her public image. Through this situation, she intends for people to hear how she stood behind two principled merchants and helped them launch their own business. Van quickly adds that if she desires recognition, she could claim credit for defeating the dragon, since that would also keep his family from discovering the truth. Panamera responds that dragon slaying is no small claim and authorities would investigate it independently to confirm the story. That scrutiny would inevitably lead to Van and Dee, so there is no realistic way to stop his family from learning that he was the one who brought down the dragon. That realization crushes Van's optimism, and he worries that his relatives will summon him back and assign this territory to someone else. Panamera then explains that the only real solution is for him to secure a noble title of his own. She clarifies that every noble either inherits a title or earns one through merit. Since she began as a mere knight, she had to climb the long, difficult path, but because Van is the son of a marquis, he could realistically obtain the rank of baron from the king without too much resistance. Van cannot see how that would be possible, and Panamera tells him the answer is simple. He must publicly claim the achievement of slaying the dragon himself, because that feat alone would be enough to justify granting him a noble title of his own. Van freaks out the moment he hears that because the last thing he wants is fame and spotlight, but Panamera tells him straight that there is no other path. She says she understands his fear because when she first earned her title, she gained a swarm of enemies overnight, but she handled them by burning them to ash like the absolute boss she is. She tells Van that if anyone tries to mess with him, he should just fire his ballista at them and make an example out of it because that kind of response shuts people up real fast. Van stands there wondering what the hell he is supposed to do with the most illegal yet ridiculously effective life tip he has ever received. He asks her if she does not need the credit for killing a dragon to move up in rank, but her expression sharpens instantly and she tells him she does not need some kid worrying about her future. Afterward, Van returns to the brothers and informs them that Panamera has agreed to sponsor them. They are stunned at first, but that shock quickly shifts into pure excitement when it sinks in that they can actually establish their own trading company. Without wasting time, they purchase all the dragon materials from Van for 130 platinum coins and begin preparing to transport the goods to the capital. But then, they hit a serious problem because the veteran merchants have taken all the carriages with them, leaving the brothers completely stranded. Unsure of their next move, they hesitate until Van calmly offers to construct a carriage for them himself. At that same moment, Panamera arrives and lends them her war horses, beasts that move like elite athletes compared to ordinary mounts. At the same time, the two greedy jackasses are riding ahead, laughing to themselves and convinced the brothers will soon crawl back begging, since they have no way to move their cargo. Then out of nowhere, Panamera speeds past them with the newly built carriage. The merchants freeze for a second trying to process what they just witnessed, and it finally dawns on them that the brothers are about to launch their own company under her protection. Not long after, Panamera arrives at the royal capital and presents herself before King Dino, who smiles at the sight of her and casually asks if she has come seeking yet another promotion. Panamera replies that she is there to request a noble title for a friend instead, which immediately piques the king's interest. He asks why this friend is absent, and Panamera explains that he is stationed in a remote village safeguarding it, so he cannot appear in person, but his accomplishments are remarkable and only mark the beginning of his rise. The king grows curious after hearing her speak so highly of him and asks for details about his identity and deeds. Panamera answers that the man she refers to is Van, the youngest son of Marquis Halpa Furcio, and the one who brought down a forest dragon. The whole royal court erupts into whispers and low chatter the second they hear that, and the king wastes no time asking whether the boy is some kind of high-tier elemental mage. Panamera calmly explains that Van actually wields production magic and is only 8 years old at the moment. She then goes all in praising Van, describing how he arrived at the village only to find it under siege and how he drove off the bandits with just a small group of knights and adventurers backing him up. She also recounts how he used his production magic to rebuild the crumbling settlement into a full-fledged fortress before taking on a forest dragon and bringing it down himself. The king finds that story even harder to swallow, but Panamera presents a fang from the forest dragon as solid proof. She then invites King Dino to personally visit Van's domain, confident that once he sees it with his own eyes, he will have no choice but to elevate Van further and grant him additional land to govern. The king is intrigued by the proposal and ultimately bestows upon Van the title of Baron. Panamera then makes the announcement publicly to stir the crowd and spark talk about Van's accomplishments, curious to see how the ripple effects will unfold. Back in the settlement, Van redesigns the homes and constructs several new ones to make the place feel more established. He also erects 2 towering structures outside the perimeter, serving both as a symbol of a growing civilization and as watchtowers to monitor any approaching danger. Later, he chooses to eat lunch at the top of one of the towers with his companions, and afterward, they look down over the expanding town from above. Esparta then suggests that it is time to stop calling it a village and start referring to it as a town, proposing the name Van Town. Van is irritated since he has no interest in turning his name into a label, but everyone else seems to love the idea. They then enjoy some cake baked by Tilly, made possible thanks to the ingredients now stocked in the store opened by the brothers. Right then, Kamsen spots a group gathered outside the gate, and Van heads over to see who has arrived this time. When he opens the gate, he finds a band of filthy and starving villagers asking for Cedo Village. Van turns to Esparta for clarification, and he explains that Cedo was the settlement's original name, even if it was never officially recognized. Van asks the weary newcomers what they are seeking, and they explain that they come from a nearby village burdened by crushing taxes, with no labor left because their lord conscripted all the young people into his army. They had heard rumors that this place had transformed rapidly and hoped to find some form of salvation here. Van realizes they are from Ferdinando County, with whom he shares strained relations. That makes him hesitate about taking them in as refugees, Yet he cannot bring himself to turn away people in such desperate condition. After a brief moment of thought, he decides to welcome them into his settlement. He asks whether they would be willing to become his citizens instead, and their leader cautiously asks if he truly means to accept them, even though they have no money to contribute in taxes. Van reassures them that taxes are the last thing they need to worry about right now, promising to build homes for them and make sure they are properly fed. The villagers look around in disbelief, wondering if they somehow stumbled into heaven, and Van then asks how many people are left in their village. The leader answers that there are 300 in total, and Van immediately says he will dispatch adventurers to escort everyone safely here. The man's eyes well up at that, and he asks how they could ever repay such generosity. Van brushes it off modestly and mentions he will also send carriages to transport their belongings, but the leader explains that they own cows that can haul everything themselves. That catches Van's attention, and the leader adds that they have 10 cows thanks to the wide pasture lands near their village. Van lights up at the news because with cows they can establish a dairy in his town and finally enjoy a steady supply of milk and its many products. Not long after, Ortho and his companions guide the neighboring villagers toward Van's town, quietly questioning how this decision makes any sense. Pluriel snaps at them to quit complaining and concentrate on the job, so they spread out and begin reassuring the weary newcomers. Ortho walks beside an exhausted woman who admits she opposed moving somewhere even more remote than their old village. Ortho concedes her point about geography, then reassures her that the place they are heading to is nothing short of paradise. Before long, they reach the town where Van has arranged a barbecue to greet the drained and discouraged refugees. The newcomers can hardly believe they are being served such flavorful food and begin devouring the grilled meat with tears streaming down their faces. After eating, several of them approach Van to ask if there is work available because they want to earn their keep. Van quickly understands they fear being thrown out if they do not contribute, so he tells them they can help manage the shops he is establishing and assist with farming the land. The villagers say they know how to tend fields but have no experience running a business. Van assures them they can leave the complicated matters to educated individuals and simply handle what they are capable of. At that moment, the village chief steps forward to greet the guests and declares that Van has transformed their lives for the better, and now they want their new neighbors to share in that prosperity. The refugees are already deeply moved, yet Van still has one more surprise. He presents cake made with milk from their own cows. He tells the new residents that their future will only improve as he grows the settlement from a town into a city, and for the first time in a long while, everyone feels like they are finally living instead of merely scraping by. Life in Van Town has been steady and serene, and all the major construction efforts are finally complete. The streets are paved, the homes are restored, and the whole place looks sharper than ever. Because of that, Esparta decides it is the ideal moment for Van to get back to his lessons. He thinks Van has ignored his studies for far too long, but Van strongly disagrees. In his mind, he has earned a serious break after grinding so hard for the town. He wants space to unwind, breathe, and actually enjoy life a little. To him, cracking open books right now just feels plain wrong. Out of nowhere, Ortho and his crew suddenly appear. They look uneasy, and they rush to apologize to Van and explain that they accidentally uncovered the entrance to a dungeon near the village. This is exactly the kind of thing nobody wanted to deal with. Esparta immediately turns grave. If the dungeon entrance has truly been discovered, they have to inform the royal capital at once. It is critical information and cannot be brushed aside, so he proposes dispatching a messenger without delay. Van starts thinking it through carefully, and if word about the dungeon spreads, adventurers from all over the empire will flood into his town. The peaceful village will turn loud and overcrowded. Even worse, his father could catch wind of all the progress Van has made. If that happens, his father might reassign him to another village yet again. Ortho and his team feel ashamed for stumbling onto the dungeon, and they are afraid they have created a mess. Still, Van tells them not to carry the blame. Now that the dungeon has been revealed, there is no way to conceal it. Van remembers that Zara, the scout of Ortho's party, was the one who located the dungeon. For that reason, Van asks Zara to head to the royal capital and deliver the report. Ortho and the others admit Zara is the best fit for the task, but they still insist on accompanying him since he is their teammate. Van has another idea, and he instructs the rest of the group to remain near the dungeon and collect further details about it. He adds that there will be a gold reward for completing the job. The instant they hear about gold, their hesitation vanishes, and they cheerfully send Zara off by himself, wishing him a safe journey. Zara is also granted a personal reward from Van, a short blade forged from mithril. Mithril is an incredibly rare and costly metal, so the weapon is priceless. Zara accepts the assignment with pride. Now the others even regret not being chosen, but Zara refuses to trade places. With everything decided, they all move out toward their separate objectives, and Van wishes them success. As Zara rides through the wide plains toward the royal capital, he keeps glancing at his new mithril sword with admiration. Just then, he notices a carriage lying overturned. Surrounding it are several massive orcs, each standing close to 8 feet tall. Under normal circumstances, facing enemies like that alone would be risky, but with his new mithril blade in hand, he feels confident and he rushes straight into the fight. The sword slices cleanly through the orcs, and before long, he brings them all down with surprising ease. After the battle comes to a close, a young woman slowly steps out from where she had been concealed. She introduces herself as Flameria, and she looks genuinely impressed by Xara's ability and assumes he must be some well-known adventurer. Xara modestly explains that he is nothing more than a regular traveler who simply happened to pass through. Flameria expresses her gratitude for rescuing her, then mentions that she intends to make the long journey back to the royal capital on foot and begins to say her farewell. Xara stops her and tells her that he is also heading toward the royal capital. He offers to let her ride his horse so they can make the trip together. Flameria hesitates because she does not want to burden him any further, and she feels he has already done more than enough by saving her life. Still, Xara assures her that it truly is no inconvenience. Before she can protest again, he carefully lifts her onto the horse. Just before they set off, Xara asks where exactly she plans to go once they reach the royal capital. Flameria explains that her father had once held the title of Baron, but he was killed during a dispute. After his passing, their territory was seized by others, and with her home gone and her title stripped away, she has no option but to seek employment. So she is now traveling to the royal capital to work as a maid in a noble household. Xara listens closely, and once he understands her circumstances, he realizes that she now has the freedom to decide her own future. Then he makes an unexpected proposal. Rather than going to the royal capital to serve as a maid, she could move to Van Town instead. He explains that the town is expanding rapidly, and there are plenty of opportunities available, and he reassures her that it is secure and properly guarded. Flameria feels deeply moved by his generosity, and after taking a brief moment to think it over, she accepts. She thanks Xara earnestly and chooses to follow his advice. At the same time, back in town, Van is already making preparations for what lies ahead. With the dungeon newly uncovered, he knows that adventurers from all over will soon start pouring in, and the peaceful atmosphere will not last much longer. To handle what is coming, Van forms a strategy. He decides to construct an outpost near the dungeon entrance, and the purpose of this outpost is to regulate the movement of adventurers and maintain stability. Van also intends to appoint Esparta as the governor of the outpost, believing he has both the discipline and the competence for the position. Furthermore, he plans for Dee and his companions to act as the chivalric order, ensuring safety and guarding the region. The construction of the outpost begins without delay, and the project moves forward efficiently, with everything remaining on track. Observing the consistent pace of progress, Van calculates that the outpost should be finished in roughly a month. Before long, Xara arrives back in town accompanied by Flameria. Van notices the unfamiliar young woman and asks about her identity. Flameria courteously explains that Xara rescued her from orcs along the road, and as Van watches their interaction, he quickly picks up on something unspoken. It is obvious that the two of them have developed feelings for each other, and even so, Van chooses not to mention it. Instead, he warmly welcomes Flameria to Van Town. With the town continuing to expand, there is always room for one more new face. Out of nowhere, a massive wave of adventurers appears, galloping toward the town on horseback. For a split second, Van's heart nearly jumps out of his chest as he wonders if some kind of catastrophe is about to hit. Xara quickly waves off his panic and tells him to calm down. It is not an attack, just adventurers heading over to scout and grind inside the dungeon. Van lets out a slow breath, realizing this is not the end of everything, just the start of a loud and hectic new phase for the town. From a distance, the riders looked intimidating as hell. Scarred faces, booming voices, and layers of clanking armor made them seem like trouble at first glance. But once they actually stepped into town, Van saw they were not villains, just rough types with blunt manners. At first, they were rowdy and a little disrespectful, pushing limits like they always do. Then Dee stepped forward and handled them with firm authority, and just like that, their tone shifted. They straightened up, adjusted their behavior, and started treating the townsfolk properly. In the end, most of them were not hostile at all, just stunned. They struggled to wrap their heads around the fact that Van, an 8-year-old kid, was running the place like a seasoned lord and keeping a growing town under control without falling apart. Not long after, Ortho and his party made their way back. The second Ortho laid eyes on Flameria, he instantly turned to Xara and demanded to know who she was. Xara casually explained that she was the girl he had saved during his journey. Ortho glanced between them once, twice, and then it clicked. The vibe was obvious, feelings were written all over their faces, and to make it worse, Van had even offered to build them a house together. Completely broken, Ortho hit the floor and started banging it like he was trying to glitch the system, furious that Xara pulled a girlfriend while he was still farming loneliness. Setting that chaos aside, Van shifted his attention to Pluriel and asked for a status report on the dungeon's surroundings. Pluriel explained that surprisingly, the area near the entrance had very few monsters roaming around. She added that dungeon environments are usually brutal and unstable, which is why adventurers sometimes set up tiny camps nearby but almost never construct anything major. Still, Van's unique abilities changed the rules entirely, making large-scale building possible even in harsh conditions. It was clear Pluriel was leading up to something, and Van could already tell where this was going. And just as he expected, she asked for his assistance in developing the land around the dungeon. Van quickly reminded her that he has a strict curfew and cannot be out for too long, but Pluriel reassured him that she and the others would guard him the entire time and that the construction would be finished quickly. Van honestly drags his feet because he would much rather focus on expanding and polishing the main town than waste energy near the dungeon. Trying to dodge the responsibility, he throws out a list of absurd, over-the-top demands, presenting them as non-negotiable conditions before he would even consider helping. To his disbelief, Pluriel agrees to every single one without blinking, and she calmly announces that they can start first thing tomorrow. Van just stands there stunned, realizing his brilliant little escape plan blew up in his face. The following morning, Van climbs into a carriage and heads toward the dungeon, clearly not thrilled about it. The road is uneven and packed with ruts, so the constant jolting makes the entire ride miserable, and Kamsin soon turns pale from motion sickness. Along the way, they come across a massive troll standing right in the middle of the road. The adventurers immediately coordinate, striking together and bringing it down faster than anyone expected. And once it falls, they erupt into loud cheers, celebrating like they just won a festival. The noise starts to get on Van's nerves, but seeing Tilly and Arte genuinely enjoying the moment eases his mood a bit. As the journey continues, Van suddenly peers out the carriage window and sharply orders the driver to halt. Not far ahead lies a wide, deep trench with nothing but two narrow wooden planks stretched across it as a temporary crossing. The adventurers shrug it off since they are accustomed to charging ahead without weighing the danger. But Van knows reckless habits like that are exactly how people get seriously hurt. He decides it cannot slide, so he orders the grown men to kneel and seriously think about the stupidity of their decision. The beams wobble and lack any real foundation, so a little extra weight could snap them in seconds. Rather than argue further, Van channels his ability and erects a solid, properly supported bridge. And once it is complete, everyone passes over without incident. When they finally arrive near the dungeon, Van immediately begins organizing what needs to be done, and he understands the adventurers require a structured headquarters. His first move is constructing a massive gate to seal off the area and stop monsters from wandering out. After that, he builds an extravagant 5-star inn where adventurers can recover after exhausting hunts. The structure looks magnificent, far beyond expectations, and the adventurers are visibly impressed. They appreciate the comfort and admire the premium facilities provided to them. As evening approaches, Van suddenly remembers his curfew. The last thing he wants is another lecture from Esparta, so before departing, he appoints Ortho as the person responsible for overseeing the base and keeping the adventurers in line. Just as they are about to leave, Arte spots something odd nearby. She draws attention to a chunk of ore sticking out from the earth. After a closer inspection, they confirm it is mithril, so Van commends Arte for her keen eye and swift reaction. By the time darkness settles, they make it back to town. Standing at the entrance is Esparta, wearing a calm yet disturbingly pleasant smile. Van's stomach tightens instantly, so he knows exactly what awaits him when curfew is broken. In desperation, he calls for assistance, but the others quickly distance themselves, unwilling to challenge Esparta. Only Ortho manages to gather the nerve to intervene, and he attempts to defend Van, insisting the delay was not his responsibility, but Esparta cuts him off coldly and orders him away. Then, without further discussion, Esparta seizes Van and pulls him back into town, leaving the rest standing there in tense, uncomfortable quiet. The following morning, Van and Arte are walking side by side through the town. While they stroll through the streets, Van realizes that Arte has already spent quite a long time living in the village, so he asks if she intends to remain there for good. Arte pauses before giving her answer, which makes Van think she is still worrying about the idea of getting engaged. Because of that, he tells her she should stop thinking about what others expect and instead focus on what she personally wants. Arte turns red and shyly confesses that what she truly wants is to be engaged to him, and Van immediately blushes as well. The news clearly makes him happy, even though he tries his best not to look overly excited. Afterward, Belle and Rango return from their trip to the royal capital. They report that they managed to officially set up their trading company, and they thank Van since they know none of it would have been possible without his help. After that, they hand him the promised payment of 30 platinum coins. Van gratefully accepts the payment and passes the coins to Tilly, but the moment Tilly takes them in her hands, she completely freezes in shock. It is the first time in her life that she has ever held such an enormous amount of money. Soon after, Kamsin explains that Panamera will not be coming back to the village for now because she still has matters to take care of within the territory of Count Ferdinando. Yet Belle and Rango also mention that Panamera said forming an alliance with Van would be far better than continuing to stay under the Count's authority, which likely means she will appear around the village more frequently. Van is honestly stunned when he hears this. At first, he assumes it means Panamera plans to move into the village permanently, but they quickly correct him and explain that she will not actually live inside the village itself. Instead, she will probably receive land somewhere close by. Van thinks about it for a moment and realizes it will probably happen sooner or later. Panamera has always been the kind of person who ends up getting exactly what she wants. Finally, Belle and Rango show Van a special item they brought back from the royal capital. At first, it just looks like a simple box, but once they open it, the box unfolds and changes shape into something resembling a mechanical crossbow, which immediately surprises Van. Apparently, this weapon represents the newest technology currently available, and it can fire as many as 10 shots in succession. Belle and Rango believe Van could use the design as inspiration to develop improved ballistas. Van becomes excited right away and begins imagining all the potential uses, and after carefully studying the mechanical crossbow for a while, he quickly recreates it using one of his cubes. However, after testing the replica, he soon notices that his copy is not perfectly accurate. Noticing that, Arte realizes that even someone like Van is not perfect. Even he can stumble and mess things up. Van lets out a quiet laugh and tells her that he actually fails at plenty of things. Aside from his production magic, there really is not much he thinks he is especially good at. Arte is caught off guard by that because she always believed Van was the kind of person who could handle everything flawlessly. Van then asks Arte about her magical aptitude, but the question makes her uneasy and she pauses before answering. Tilly notices the tension on her face and gently tells her that she does not need to say anything if she would rather keep it to herself. Van would never pressure her. Arte says it is alright and eventually admits that her aptitude lies in marionette magic. Van immediately understands the situation because marionette magic is often dismissed and looked down on, which explains why Arte felt embarrassed about it. Since Van has never actually seen marionette magic before, he asks her if she could show them how it works. Marionette magic mainly revolves around controlling puppets, so to make it easier for her, Van quickly creates a puppet from one of his blocks and asks Arte to demonstrate her capability. Arte channels her magic into the puppet and starts guiding its movements as if the figure had its own life. Van is instantly amazed by what he sees. Without thinking, he pulls Arte into a hug because he can already recognize the incredible potential hidden within her power. Tilly also notices how promising the ability is. Realizing that Arte can make puppets move with elegance and charm, she suggests putting together a small puppet show for the villagers. She believes the townspeople would love watching it, and she even adds that Van could craft another puppet using the mithril aura Arte discovered the other day. Even so, Arte still seems uncertain, and she quietly says that her magic was never meant to entertain people. Van calmly tells her that he once thought the same thing about his own power. His father even labeled him a failure simply because he possessed production magic. Yet that same production magic is what allowed him to help the village and bring joy to the people living there. At that moment, something finally clicks for Arte. Until now, she has always believed she was useless and had no worth. She truly thought she lacked any meaningful talent. But after realizing that Van once carried the same doubts and still managed to move past them, her perspective slowly begins to change. She tells herself that if Van could push through his insecurities and succeed, then she should be able to do it as well. And for the first time in her life, a faint spark of confidence begins to grow inside her. At night, the villagers gather in the town square. They quietly talk among themselves, puzzled about why they were summoned there in the first place. Nobody understands what is happening until Van steps forward and announces that Arte will be performing a show for everyone. A life-size puppet is then brought out and set in front of the crowd. Arte takes a slow breath and begins to channel her magic. Little by little, she makes the puppet bend forward in a bow, and the villagers instantly realize it's marionette magic. Some of them immediately recall that long ago, certain individuals once attempted to attack the royal family using this exact type of magic. Quiet whispers ripple through the crowd, and Arte hears them clearly, so she starts to think that the villagers are judging her and looking down on her. Van instantly notices the expression on her face, and he can tell that Arte is feeling extremely self-conscious. He understands that she is anxious about what people might think of her after the performance. She suddenly feels small and vulnerable, as if every person in the square is staring at her, ready to criticize her. For a brief second, the thought of running away crosses her mind, but instead of fleeing, Arte steadies her breathing, gathers her courage, and keeps going. She moves with careful grace, directing the puppet through a flowing dance. The puppet begins to appear almost alive as it mirrors her motions. The entire crowd watches without making a sound. The lifeless figure now moves with beauty and elegance, as though it carries a soul within it. Van once again realizes just how remarkable marionette magic truly is. It holds the ability to give motion and expression to objects that should never move at all. When the dance finally comes to an end, Arte slowly turns around to face the villagers, preparing herself for harsh criticism and cruel remarks. She expects rejection and anger because of the magic she revealed, but instead the villagers suddenly erupt into loud applause, and some of them even call out, asking her to perform once more. Van walks over to her and tells her that she succeeded, and the fear she had been carrying for so long finally fades away. Filled with emotion, Arte runs straight into his arms and thanks him. She tells him that he helped her realize something important, that the strength she needed was always inside her. She simply needed someone to help her recognize it. The following morning, Panamera heads back from the royal palace. After spending some time speaking with Arte and Van, she cannot hide her surprise. It is obvious that Arte has changed dramatically since the last time they met. There is a strong sense of confidence in her now, and it is obvious that Van has played a big role in her growth. Panamera asks Van what kind of trick he used to bring about such a change, and Van simply explains that Arte never lacked talent in the first place. What she lacked was faith in herself, and all he really did was help her realize just how extraordinary and powerful her magic actually is. Panamera is clearly impressed by his response, but she suddenly remembers the reason she came in the first place, so she quickly tells Van to kneel because His Majesty has arrived, and Van immediately drops to one knee without any hesitation. He is then introduced to Dino, the King of Scuderia, along with the King's Chancellor Aperta. King Dino informs Van that he has officially been granted the title of Baron, placing him among the lower ranks of the nobility. The king advises him to serve the nation with loyalty and to always act in the best interests of the country. Other than that, Dino mentions that he heard Van had discovered a dungeon somewhere in this region. He says that he will send people to investigate it later. Dino also heard that a forest dragon had been defeated here. Because of this, he personally came to confirm the story for himself. He asks Van to explain honestly and in detail what exactly happened. Van agrees, but he warns the king that the story may sound a little unusual. He worries that it might come across as unbelievable, so he asks Dino to keep an open mind while hearing it, and Dino has no issue with that and agrees. Van starts by explaining the village's offensive and defensive weapons. Aperta carefully studies the equipment, paying particular attention to the ballistas. He points out that while ballistas are useful for attacking enemies from long distances, they are not always practical for everyday use. Van does not fully agree with that assessment, and to demonstrate his point, he decides to show just how powerful the weapon really is. He orders Kamzin to fire one of the ballistas, and the moment it launches, it clearly reveals the incredible force behind the weapon. The king is visibly surprised because he never expected such destructive strength from something like that. What shocks Dino even more is when he learns that Van was the one who personally built every component used to create these weapons. He finds it hard to believe that a single person could design and construct all of this alone. To him, it almost sounds impossible. Van understands that his story might seem hard to believe, so he tells Dino that he will first explain how the ramparts around the village were constructed. Aperta assumes that it must have taken several years to complete such large defenses, but Van calmly explains that the entire structure was finished in no more than 4 months, and this revelation leaves both Dino and Aperta completely stunned. Afterward, Van guides them around the village, and as they stroll through the streets, the townspeople greet him with genuine warmth. Watching this, Dino comes to understand just how deep Van's bond with the villagers truly is. Dino is even more astonished when he spots a river teeming with apcalis. These creatures are incredibly scarce in the wild, and seeing so many gathered together in one place is an extraordinary sight. They press on with the tour, and Esparta shows how he shapes the land with earth magic to lay down a firm base for the wall. Then Van channels his production magic to transform that base into a sturdy rampart. The display leaves both Dino and Aperta utterly speechless. Not long after, Latavesta hears that the nation's king has arrived, so he steps forward to offer his respects. To commemorate their friendship, he presents a fragment of orichalcum. Everyone who lays eyes on it is stunned because this is no common ore. It is revered as the metal of the divinities. If it were forged into a blade, that sword alone would be valued at several hundred platinum coins. But without hesitation, Van uses his magic to forge a sword from the rare metal, but he swiftly tucks the completed blade behind his back since he does not want the king to realize how effortlessly he can accomplish something so remarkable. Panamera quietly urges him to speak truthfully, so Van chooses honesty. The king admires Van's straightforwardness and declares that he is prepared to offer any price for the weapon. Yet Van refuses payment. Instead, he requests the right to remain in the village permanently. He asks Dino to vow that, regardless of circumstances, he will never be reassigned elsewhere, and Dino acknowledges the sincerity of that wish. At the same time, Dino feels it would be a shame for Van's abilities to remain confined to such a distant corner, so he inquires whether Van would still cooperate with the royal capital if they were to dispatch an envoy to him, and Van accepts this arrangement. Dino is moved by how committed Van is to safeguarding and developing the village. Because of that devotion, he grants Van's request. Van is relieved and pleased because to him, this feels like another stride toward the peaceful life he has long desired. Before long, Dino remarks that he cannot remain away from the capital indefinitely, so he prepares to depart, but all at once they hear frantic cries from the villagers. Shouts ring out that a dragon is closing in on the settlement, so Van immediately orders everyone to man the defenses and ready the adventurers. Panamera steps in to assist as well, strengthening Van's confidence that they can manage the threat. Then the dragon sweeps toward them in a dramatic descent, and every gaze lifts to the sky as they brace themselves, uncertain of what action to take next. They narrow their focus and quickly notice the wyvern is not flying freely at all. A sorcerer is perched on its back, directing every movement. Aperta observes the scene in silence and pieces it together. Wyverns are beasts that instinctively roam and hunt in packs, so seeing one drifting solo through the sky like this is completely unnatural, and that alone tells him there's probably something hidden beneath what they can see, another danger lurking somewhere they have not detected yet. Dino catches that and instantly blames the kingdom of Yeleneta, saying this reeks of their handiwork from start to finish. Van wants to deal with the wyvern immediately, but he understands his ballista bolts will never make it that far. The beast is soaring at a height that keeps it entirely beyond their reach, so he weighs his options carefully and settles on the last possible choice. They will have to launch the prototype. At the same time, far within the forest, the 8th Prince of Yeleneta, Unimog, is not even trying to conceal his irritation. The king assigned him to command the assault on such an isolated settlement, and he would have preferred to be literally anywhere else. One of his knights attempts to clarify the logic behind the decision. The king selected him personally because this operation carries serious weight. Yeleneta and Scuderia have shared a long hostile past, and the king has resolved that the moment has come to bring that rivalry to a decisive end. Unimog listens with a blank face, completely unmoved. Even after hearing the explanation, he still refuses to treat the mission with real importance. In his mind, conquering a tiny backwater village is not a task deserving of his full focus, and he assumes it will be finished before it even truly begins. Not long after, the army reaches the gates of Van's town, and silence spreads through their ranks. None of them anticipated a remote village to be protected by walls of this magnitude. Unimog studies the structure and immediately concludes that they must be fake, so he tells his soldiers it is nothing more than an illusion, a cheap tactic meant to intimidate intruders, and he commands them to haul out the battering ram and start smashing. After repeated strikes, the ram barely leaves even the slightest mark, and Unimog can only glare at the towering walls without a single word. Moments later, Van steps onto the ramparts and peers down at the invading force. He calmly declares himself the lord of this village and directly asks their purpose. Unimog looks up, and his expression shifts in disbelief because he never imagined the ruler of this place would be a mere child. He forces himself past the shock and demands to know how fortifications like these could possibly have been constructed in such a location. Van responds plainly. He and the villagers raised them together with effort and unity, and there is no deeper secret than that. Unimog rejects the explanation outright, convinced Van is making a fool of him. He turns toward his knight and orders him to relay a message to the mage riding the wyvern and instruct him to commence the assault on the town at once. The knight falters and warns that striking without provocation like this will almost certainly invite retaliation. But Unimog brushes the concern aside, insisting there is no chance some backwater village in the middle of nowhere possesses anything capable of downing a wyvern. Van meets Panamra's gaze and gives a subtle nod. She releases a single round that soars high above the wyvern, then bursts apart in midair into dozens of smaller fragments that cascade downward and shred the beast in seconds. When the haze fades, the wyvern has vanished, and Van calmly explains what struck it. The weapons are known as shuriken, slim and lightweight, yet backed by overwhelming impact. It is their first time deploying it in actual combat, but even Van can tell it exceeded expectations. Aperta fixes his eyes on the shattered remains and cannot conceal his shock. A device with no elemental magic whatsoever just delivered force comparable to an advanced spell. Dino steps forward and peers down at Unimog from above. Unimog struggles to comprehend the scene before him and demands to know why the king of Scuderia is standing inside some distant, insignificant village. With the situation undeniable, Unimog has no alternative. He commands his troops to withdraw, fully aware they are outclassed. As events unfold, Dino's mind drifts to Van's father, the Marquis, who cast his own son out merely because the boy lacked elemental magic, so the Marquis never understood what his child was truly capable of. Dino reaches a silent conclusion. Once he returns, he will dedicate greater effort and funding toward the study of magical potential, because it is obvious there is far more beneath the surface than anyone realizes. Soon, Unimog is escorted to what appears to be a holding cell for interrogation. He drops to the ground and initially refuses to speak. Then Panamra steps in close and applies a bit of pressure, and suddenly he starts spilling everything. He reveals that the kingdom of Yeleneta has been targeting the remote villages under the Marques's authority for years. The strategy was to advance little by little, beginning with the smallest and most secluded communities. A settlement of this scale was meant to be an effortless opening move, something they could seize with minimal resistance before advancing deeper. Panamra hears the explanation and almost feels secondhand embarrassment for him because he was shut down before he even crossed the main gate. Aperta inclines forward and questions whether Yeleneta's army is striking any other regions at the same time, and Unimog confirms that they are. While events unfolded here, another division had already advanced toward the fortress city of Skudet. The atmosphere in the chamber shifts instantly. They relay the information to Dino without delay. Aperta moves quickly, insisting they must return to the royal capital, assemble every soldier they can, and march to reinforce Skudet before it falls. Dino accepts the plan at once, but sets a single requirement. Van must accompany them. Van considers the request in silence. He understands this is normally the sort of call he would accept immediately. He expresses sincere gratitude for being trusted with such responsibility, yet explains that he cannot depart. His settlement is still in a critical stage of development, and he refuses to abandon it now. Dino and the others remain uncertain. The village already possesses armaments strong enough to repel major dangers. Van sees their reasoning but responds firmly. The cannons are formidable, yes, but his ambitions for this place stretch far beyond its current state. They have only achieved a fraction of what he envisions, and the greater part of the work still lies ahead. Panamra lets out a light laugh at that. She admits she is truly eager to witness what the village will become once he shapes it fully, since even now it is extraordinary. Still, she does not waver. When a kingdom faces peril, a noble is obligated to stand with fellow nobles, so personal circumstances do not override that duty. Van reflects briefly and accepts the truth in her words. It is indeed his burden to bear, and he consents to join them, though he adds one stipulation of his own. He will assemble and lead his own forces, and Dino agrees immediately. Soon, Van calls his team together and informs them of the situation. He has been requested to aid in defending a nearby city and will soon depart. Esparta will oversee the village in his absence. D, Hamzin, and the rest of the group will accompany him. But before their departure, Ortho and his companions approach and request permission to serve as his personal guard during the journey. Van is genuinely moved and encourages them to notify other adventurers as well, offering 5 gold per person as compensation. Ortho and the others trade surprised looks. The amount is exceedingly generous, yet Van sees it as only fair. Those willing to risk their lives deserve to be rewarded without hesitation. Panamra approaches Van and informs him that she will return to Count Ferdinando first to deliver a full report on everything that has taken place. Afterward, she intends to reorganize her troops and dispatch them to Scudet as reinforcements. She then asks what armaments he intends to deploy. Van pauses to consider it and quickly realizes that none of his ballistas are currently in condition to be transported. Before he can settle on a solution, Arte steps in with an idea. She offers to deploy her marionettes as long-range firepower in their place. Not long before their departure, Van assembles everyone and carefully outlines the objective of the operation. He reassures them that there is no need for fear. They will not be storming the front ranks. The mission is straightforward. Every individual gathered here returns home alive. He gives his word that once everything is resolved, they will head back to the village and hold a proper barbecue to celebrate together. Meanwhile, at his estate, Van's father, Halpa, receives news of the assault on Scudet. He immediately instructs his butler to contact the surrounding lords and request aid. The butler cautiously suggests that Van's nearby settlement might be able to assist. Halpa interrupts him before he can continue. The village can scarcely sustain itself, he argues. Furthermore, Van is incapable of wielding elemental magic, making it pointless to involve him. Some time later, when the market reaches the southern gate of Scudet, the sight halts him in disbelief. Fortifications once deemed unbreakable have been shattered by Yelenetta's wyvern onslaught. After a brief assessment, Lord Halpa recommends withdrawing to reorganize their forces. Then the commanding officer reports that the majority of their soldiers have already fallen. The commander steels himself, convinced his life is about to end. Yet when the enemy abruptly turns away and advances elsewhere, he remains frozen, unable to comprehend why they would abandon him instead of finishing the job. At the western gate, the reason becomes clear. One of Arte's marionettes sweeps forward in a precise motion, slicing through multiple wyverns in a single strike. From a secure position, Arte directs its movements. Those witnessing it are left speechless. Even Arte herself had not fully grasped the extent of the strength she commanded. Van quickly evaluates the battlefield and determines that diverting the enemy's focus away from the wounded soldiers will give them a chance to retreat, and they execute the strategy flawlessly. As Yelenetta's troops rush forward, Van's unit responds in seamless coordination and overcomes them with surprising ease. Then one of the wyverns peels away from the swarm and plunges straight toward Van. Arte moves without hesitation, snapping her marionette forward to cut it off just before impact. Van scans the field and realizes that the brief clash gave the wounded troops enough breathing room to retreat. He orders everyone to withdraw, but Ortho argues against it. They hold the upper hand right now, and if they press the attack, there is a solid chance they can finish this battle completely. But Van refuses because victory means nothing if it costs even a single life. And if they advance and one person fails to return, then to him, the entire fight was meaningless. Later on, Lord Halpa and his knights finally secure a safe position. One of the soldiers asks what their next move will be, and Halpa answers without hesitation that they will reclaim Scudet. They will regroup, restore their forces, and march again. Yet even as he declares it, a single thought gnaws at him: how did they escape with their lives? Just then, Murcia, one of Halpa's sons, rides in and bows his head, apologizing for arriving behind schedule. Soon after, Dino arrives on the scene. Halpa and Murcia bow the moment they recognize him. Dino requests a detailed report about the situation in Scudet, and Halpa informs him that the city has already been lost. He recounts every event step by step, but Aperta remains puzzled over one crucial detail. If the situation was truly that catastrophic, how did any of them survive? So Halpa explains that the wyverns abruptly ceased their assault and withdrew without warning. No one understood why, but Dino pieces it together at once. That was Van, and he tells Halpa and Murcia that they might not have heard, yet Van transformed that distant village he was assigned to into something extraordinary. He slew a dragon and was granted an official title, all at such a young age. Halpa stares in disbelief, and he can barely process it because Van does not even wield elemental magic. Dino lowers his gaze and notices Mercia's hand clenched tightly at his side. At first, he assumes it is envy. A younger brother receiving a title first would sting anyone, but then Mercia's expression collapses and tears stream down his face. He is not bitter at all. He tells them he has never been prouder of Van. That evening, Van and his companions gather around a campfire. Van explains that although they have satisfied their immediate obligations as nobles, they remain allies of Skudet and must continue offering assistance. Arte keeps her eyes fixed on the flames and confesses that this was her first true brush with war. It terrified her, and she never wants to face something like that again. Van looks at her and cannot stand seeing her shaken. He tells her he has a solution. He will construct a catapult. They will provide long-range support from afar, ensuring none of them ever has to stand on the front lines again, and Arte will not need to feel that fear anymore. Without wasting time, Van begins shaping materials with his production magic right there. Almost immediately, he encounters a setback. The catapults are far too massive to transport from their current location, which means he will have to construct them directly at the battlefield instead. The following day, Van curses his excitement from the night before because now he is stuck personally transporting freshly built weapons, which means marching right back into the damn battlefield. He keeps grumbling the whole way while his men stay convinced that this new gear will turn the tide in their favor. Before long, they arrive at the city closest to Skudet, and Van observes that everything looks ordinary at first glance, though there are far more troops stationed around than usual. Dee explains that after the crushing loss at Skudet, their forces chose this location as a temporary headquarters to recover and regroup. Out of nowhere, a squad of knights he instantly recognizes steps into his path, and at their front stands his father, Halpa, staring down at Van with cold contempt. Van offers a respectful greeting, but Halpa wastes no time asking whether he truly earned the rank of Baron by slaying a dragon. Van calmly confirms it, adding that it was nothing more than a typical forest dragon, yet even mentioning the creature's name alone is enough to make the surrounding knights nearly lose their nerve. Halpa demands to know how Van accomplished such a feat, since even a prodigy elemental mage like himself could never defeat a beast like that solo. Van explained that he brought the forest dragon down using his ballista. Halpa explodes in anger at the claim, utterly refusing to believe it, and his soldiers share the same disbelief. Van already understands that arguing with his stubborn old man is pointless, so there is no winning this conversation. And as he considers his next move, Panamra arrives looking for him and informs him that the king is present as well, eager to inspect any new weapons Van has crafted. Relieved to see her, Van quickly forms a plan and he casually asks his father if he would care to examine the ballista for himself after presenting the upgraded weapon to the king. And Panamra backs him up and tells Halpa that if he has spare ammunition, she can demonstrate the version she brought along. But Van interrupts to explain that he has already improved the design beyond that. So Panamra immediately shifts into negotiation mode with Van while Halpa watches the exchange with open disgust and disbelief. Not long after, the three of them head to meet the king, and Van cannot help but admire how fierce and intimidating the royal guards appear. Panamra mentions that each of them is a formidable warrior, then deliberately stirs trouble by claiming that Van could defeat them with his equipment. The guards clearly take offense to that remark, and Van feels awkward seeing it in their eyes, but Panamra only laughs and escorts him inside to see the king, who is currently holding a council with the regional nobles to reclaim Skudet. Among them, Van spots Arte's father, Count Ferdinando, and suddenly finds himself unsure of how to deal with him. Afterward, the king asks Aperta whether there's anything they need to be especially wary of, and he immediately launches into a long explanation about how the kingdom of Yeleneta has never managed to seize Skudet until now. This time, they pulled it off in a single day by deploying the Wyvern Squad along with those Black Sphere weapons that detonated and wrecked everything in range. Van quickly understands that these backward fools don't even know what a bomb is yet, and without a proper countermeasure, they're completely helpless against them. The king comes to the same conclusion and looks deeply troubled, though not nearly as devastated as Halpa, who lost a massive number of soldiers in the explosions. Aperta then turns to Van and asks whether he has devised any kind of plan, and Van answers that all they need to do is bring down the wyverns before they can release the bombs, and after that, reclaiming victory will be simple. The other nobles sneer at Van, telling him to head back to preschool and play pretend over there, but the king and his advisor sense that Van might actually hold the key to solving this crisis. King Dino orders Van to head to the battlefield and take command of the mission to reclaim Skudet, but Van flatly refuses, leaving everyone stunned. They can't believe a mere boy would dare push back against the king, yet the king himself is even more shocked that Van has no interest in the prestige that comes with fighting on the front lines. Van calmly explains that he's not a damage dealer but a support, and more importantly, he has no intention of getting himself injured. The nobles erupt, accusing him of being selfish, and they even start blaming Halpa for raising a coward. Halpa, furious beyond measure, snaps at Van and tells him he's completely out of line, reminding him that he's nothing more than the lord of some insignificant village and has no right to speak to the king in such a manner. Van fires back, saying none of the nobles present understand what it's like to defend a weak, isolated village, and at that moment, the king steps in. He tells Van to continue, but instead of revealing his tactical plan, Van begins describing the hardships he faced while protecting a tiny settlement without any support from his family. He explains that he has strengthened the village far beyond what it used to be, yet it remains small and would be crushed without question if the Yeleneta kingdom decided to strike it. One noble questions why the enemy kingdom would even waste time targeting a remote, insignificant village, and Perta responds that there are plenty of reasons they might. To begin with, they already dispatched a prince to conquer that very village, proving they are serious about invading the Scuderia kingdom this time, and they will attempt to seize it again. The atmosphere turns heavy at those words, and Van states plainly that he intends to safeguard the village he built alongside his friends, which is exactly why he cannot afford to be wounded here. Count Ferdinando tells Van he understands the position he is in, but he asks whether Van truly believes he can hold off the Yeleneta army, even from his own village. Van answers without hesitation, yet the surrounding nobles struggle to accept that confidence. He assures the king that he still intends to contribute to their victory, even if he prefers to remain in a support capacity. He explains that he will provide the Scuderia forces with ballistae and catapults in exchange for being allowed to return to his village, and the king agrees without objection. Van states that he will begin crafting them at once, and Halpa questions whether he is taking the war seriously at all, pointing out that starting now would never leave enough time to finish. Van stays composed and suggests it would be wiser for them to witness it firsthand. He leads everyone outside and constructs a ballista and a catapult on the spot as a demonstration, leaving the nobles completely stunned. Van asks his father for his opinion, and Halpa coolly dismisses it as nothing more than a display model that cannot even fire, so he has no interest. He walks away to arrange his troops while the other nobles remain to watch the full demonstration. Van explains that the catapult is built to launch shuriken capable of taking down wyverns, and the king asks if he is certain it can overcome the enemy. Van responds that unless Yeleneta has another hidden trump card, his weapon should be more than sufficient to deal with them. The king places his trust in him and orders the nobles to resume their duties for the day. At that moment, Tilly arrives to escort Van and brings Arte with her. Arte, however, is visibly anxious because she knows her father is present, and the instant she spots him, she stops where she stands. Memories of how her mother treated her surface in her mind, and she timidly asks her father how things are at home. He shows little interest in speaking with her and replies that everything is fine, but he is occupied with war preparations and cannot spare the time. He leaves after that, and Arte remains shaken from the encounter. Van notices her unease and asks if she is feeling unwell, and tells Tilly to take her back so she can rest. Later on, Van discusses battle plans with his companions. He appoints Kamzin to command the artillery division, while Dee and Ortho volunteer to guard them against enemy assaults. Van is satisfied with their commitment, and Panamera declares that the decisive confrontation is approaching. She argues that since the supposedly impenetrable fortress fell to the Yeleneta kingdom with such ease, the era of elemental mages has ended and a new era of technology has begun. Dee wonders aloud if that means Yeleneta now possesses the strongest military in the world, but Panamera believes that with the innovative weapons Van creates, he alone could overpower their entire army. The following morning, the battle erupts and the troops surge forward toward the stronghold, while Van remains at the back, watching everything unfold and directing the flow of combat. As the Yeleneta commander spots the Scuderia forces fanning out and striking from every side, he assumes they are attempting to chip away at the defenses rather than storming the front gate head-on. The tactic doesn't rattle him in the slightest, since he believes the advantage still lies firmly with him. He signals his archers to unleash a volley on the advancing soldiers, but Van had already anticipated that move. He instructs Dee to commence the plan, and Dee instantly commands his unit to raise their shields. The barriers absorb the shower of arrows effortlessly, as if the assault were nothing more than a drizzle, leaving the Yeleneta generals stunned by their durability. Yet, those shields are forged from ordinary timber, just like most of Van's handiwork. Frustrated, the opposing commander calls his mages forward and orders them to shatter the shields. Their synchronized spells begin pressing Dee and his troops to the brink, but he urges them to withstand the barrage, promising that reinforcements are about to turn the tide. At that very moment, a blazing fireball slams into the fortress gate and panic flickers across the enemy leader's face when he spots the archmages assembled before it. He suddenly understands that the skirmish outside was merely a diversion meant to strip the gate of protection, but realization comes far too late. Following Halpa's lead, the mages unleash a relentless assault on the entrance, and in the climax, Halpa and Ferdinando combine their power in a coordinated strike that blows the gate apart. With the breach made, the primary force storms into the fortress, yet the enemy general roars for his men to halt them no matter the cost. A brutal clash erupts within the city walls, steel ringing against steel as the knights struggle against Yeleneta's elite fighters. Out of nowhere, Panamera bursts onto the scene, carving through several foes in a sweeping blast and opening a path for Dee and his soldiers to push forward. At the same time, Halpa finds himself pressured by hostile troops, but Ortho and his squad rush in to back him up. They cut down a handful of enemy knights in swift succession, and soon the rowdy crew joins the chaos, tearing through the battlefield. Halpa turns to Ortho and asks whether they all serve under Van, and Ortho confirms it, leaving Halpa momentarily unsure how he is supposed to respond. At the same time, the general of Yeleneta begins to lose his nerve as the battle shifts out of his favor, so he resorts to deploying his ultimate trump card. He commands the Wyvern unit to charge, and within seconds, a swarm of Wyverns surges into the sky. That was exactly the moment Van had been anticipating, and he orders Kamzin to bring them down. Kamzin relays the command to the catapult crew, who launch massive spheres packed with razor-sharp shurikens high into the air. The projectiles detonate mid-flight, scattering lethal blades in every direction, and the rain of steel is more than enough to send the Wyverns crashing violently back to the earth. Cheers erupt across the battlefield at the sight, but one stubborn Wyvern somehow survives both the explosion and the fall. It staggers upright, preparing to tear into the troops, who instantly realize they are completely outmatched. Ortho and Zara dash in to intercept it, striking with everything they have, yet even with Van's upgraded weapons, they cannot penetrate its hardened scales. Still, that was never their real goal. They only needed to force it down long enough for the ballista to line up the shot. The massive bolts slam into the creature, arrows bristling from its body, but unbelievably it still refuses to die. That is when Panamera steps forward and obliterates the poor beast with a devastating hollow purple blast, and D immediately dashes in to decapitate it and claim the final blow. With that, the Wyvern squad is completely annihilated, and Panamera declares that the toughest phase of the war is finally behind them. Ferdinando and Halpa watch in stunned disbelief, unable to process that Van's forces are capable of such overwhelming feats after they had doubted him all along. The Yeleneta general comes to the bitter realization that victory is no longer possible and attempts to flee, only to find Ortho and Zara already standing in his path. One look at them is enough to crush any thought of escape, and he surrenders without resistance. Once the fighting ends, Halpa quietly starts to withdraw from the battlefield. Mercia stops him and asks if he truly intends to leave without meeting Van. Halpa admits that he misjudged Van's strength and says he cannot bring himself to face him right now. Elsewhere, Van celebrates the triumph with his companions as D insists that the credit belongs entirely to him. Van brushes it off, claiming he merely directed the operation from the rear while they carried the real burden on the front lines. At that moment, Ortho and Zara arrive, escorting the captured Yeleneta general. Panamera immediately steps forward, ready to break him and extract every secret he knows. The man nearly collapses in terror at the sight of her and quickly spills everything. Their strategy had been to strike 3 key regions of the Scuderia kingdom and seize vast territory in one decisive campaign. Van's village and Scudet were both targeted, along with Ferdinando County, news that hits Arte like a chilling jolt. Arte then meets Van's gaze and asks him to allow her to go there by herself. Van insists on going with her, but Arte cuts him off, explaining that she cannot keep leaning on him for every single thing. More than that, she says this is a matter of her own bloodline and something she needs to face on her own. Van stares at Arte in shock because he has never seen her this resolute about anything before. But after taking a brief moment to think, Van comes to a realization since he is only the lord of a small, far-off village. If Ferdinando County were to be rescued by a place that small, Van is sure it would damage his reputation and could even put his territory at risk. With that in mind, he asks if he can at least assign an escort to ensure Arte's safety, and Arte agrees to that much. Ortho and his party then step forward as well, saying they will serve as her escorts out of deep respect for Van and their willingness to help however they can. And besides, adventurers like them getting involved would not stir up any political trouble, so Van nods and tells them to do whatever it takes to protect Arte. Not long after, Arte reaches her hometown and witnesses Wyverns raining down black bombs that rip the city to pieces. She lets out a cry and bolts toward it, her thoughts instantly racing to her mother. But Ortho grabs her arm and pulls her back, telling her that if they enter the fight now, they might still be able to shift the tide. Even so, Arte tells Ortho and the other adventurers that they cannot interfere because it has to be someone from House Ferdinando who forces the Yeleneta kingdom to retreat. At the same time, Sharon, the Empress of House Ferdinando, stands by her window with her daughter, watching as the Yeleneta kingdom ravages their land below. She turns to her daughter and gently tells her not to be afraid because no matter what unfolds, she will make it appear as though she chose to end her own life for the sake of future generations. Those future generations must believe that the eldest princess departed without shame or lingering regrets. As she speaks, the princess looks at her with nothing but terror in her eyes, and Sharon meets that gaze, and it begins to remind her painfully of Arte. At the same time, the soldiers of the Yeleneta army prepare to storm into Ferdinando County, completely convinced that victory is already theirs. Yet just before they advance, they notice that one of the wyverns has fallen from the sky. Confusion spreads through their ranks, but then they catch sight of a silver knight slicing through the wyverns in a single sweeping motion. What they do not realize is that the silver knight is nothing more than a puppet, controlled by Arte's marionette magic. Their eyes then shift to the hill above, where they see the flag of Ferdinando County raised high beside a formation of troops, and they assume reinforcements have arrived. With that, they decide to rush straight toward them. Ortho and the others quickly understand that the Yeleneta army is targeting them first, so they brace themselves for the incoming clash. At the same time, Arte is still fighting to steady her breathing because this is the very first time she has ever set foot on an actual battlefield. She understands it will not be anywhere close to as effortless as Van always makes it seem, but she has no choice except to pour everything she has into this. All at once, she steels herself and steps forward before the gathered adventurers, calling on them to stand with her and lend their power so she can protect her hometown. Ortho asks Arte what her plan is, and without hesitation she answers that she's going straight to the front lines. She maintains her grip over the Silver Knight with her magic and directs it to cut down yet another surge of Yeleneta soldiers. Ortho and the rest of the adventurers jump into the fray as well and handle several enemies on their own without even showing signs of strain. Zara ends up surrounded at one point, but the Silver Knight moves in just in time to shield him, though she suffers a strike to her left arm because of it. But after more intense clashes, they manage to eliminate every last Yeleneta soldier on the ground, and for a brief second everyone assumes the battle is finished, until Pluriel points out that the wyverns circling overhead are still a threat, and what shocks them most is the overwhelming number of wyverns looming above, easily more than 50 in total. The captain of the Yeleneta army then commands every wyvern to target the Silver Knight. As they swoop down in unison, the Silver Knight responds swiftly, cutting down several of them with single decisive strikes. Eventually, she becomes surrounded and is moments away from being struck by an attack she cannot evade, when a second of Arte's marionettes suddenly appears to pull her clear of danger, leaving everyone stunned since none of them realized she was capable of controlling two at once. Arte understands that handling two puppets simultaneously will drain her mana at an alarming rate, so she knows she must end this fast. A cluster of wyverns charge both marionettes together. The Yeleneta captain is convinced this is the end, but Arte reaches deeper than ever before and unleashes her true strength, guiding both marionettes into a perfectly synchronized strike that slices down half of the wyverns in a single sweeping blow. In that instant, Arte's thoughts slip back to her childhood, when she constantly believed she was a disappointment because her talent for marionette magic was viewed as disgraceful and unfit for someone of noble birth. Yet she knows that meeting Van was one of the most important turning points in her life, because he gave her the courage to accept her gift and push it to heights she never imagined. The purple marionette then follows through with a crushing strike against the final wyvern, smashing it down to the earth. Realizing they are powerless without their wyverns, the Yeleneta soldiers panic and retreat quickly, while the adventurers cheer and triumph. At the same time, within the palace walls, Sharon struggles to grasp what on earth could have rescued them from both the invading soldiers and the swarm of wyverns. Then Count Ferdinando steps inside and calmly reveals that every single wyvern was brought down by two marionettes under Arte's control, the very daughter they once cast aside simply for wielding marionette magic. The Count cannot help but highlight the bitter irony in that truth and the cruel way they once treated her. Sharon realizes it as well, and the weight of that guilt overwhelms her, leaving her in tears of deep remorse. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the adventurers urge Arte to go see her parents, insisting they must accept her now after she used her magic to save them all. But Arte remains doubtful, especially remembering how her parents despised her magic for so long. Instead, she suggests heading back home since Van is waiting. When they finally return to Van's town, everyone greets Arte with genuine warmth. Van commends her for protecting her hometown, yet Arte cannot feel proud because she believes she lacked the confidence he always shows when giving orders. Van reassures her and tells her she does not need to imitate anyone, that being herself is more than enough. He looks at her and says she did wonderfully, welcoming her home. Arte smiles through teary eyes and admits she is truly glad to be back. Later on, Van mentions that while she was gone, he constructed new facilities and additional shops around town, so he brings her along to see everything. As they stroll through the village, Van reflects on how uncertain he once felt about settling there. Now, however, he is convinced he made the right decision. Despite the mix of races, personalities, and even species living there, they somehow coexist in harmony, and that thought fills him with quiet joy. Afterward, they throw a barbecue to celebrate Arte's triumph, and the entire village joins in the fun. During the celebration, Van recalls how his father drove him out of the Empire because of his gift for production magic, which ultimately led him to become the lord of a small, struggling village. Yet because of that exile, he found a new life surrounded by dependable, lively, and fascinating companions. With their help, he strengthened the village and overcame countless challenges, and for that he feels nothing but gratitude. All of a sudden, Esparta cuts in to remind Van that it is time to study, while Dee quickly adds that sword practice should come first since this is the age of blades. But Van has zero interest in either option because all he wants is a quiet, peaceful life, so he quietly slips away and makes a run for it. As he dashes off, he once again thinks about everything the village has endured and accomplished. The memories stir something inside him and he turns back with renewed determination, declaring that he will continue moving forward at his own rhythm to make this place a better home for all.